Hello, friend. Welcome to Sleepy Old World. Get comfortable. Before we go anywhere tonight, I want to say this quickly, and then I promise I will leave it alone. If these stories have become part of your evening, a like genuinely helps more than you would guess, and subscribing means this little corner of the internet will be here waiting for you tomorrow night, and the night after that, without you having to go looking for it. That is really all it is. A small kindness from you to me, so I can keep doing this. What I would love to know is where you are listening from right now. Drop it in the comments. I genuinely read every single one. All right, love. Let your shoulders drop from wherever they have been holding on all day. Are you comfortable? Good. Let's go. Forget the table you're picturing. The long polished mahogany, the silver epergne piled with hothouse grapes. 12 places set with more forks than any one person could reasonably need. That table exists tonight, somewhere above us, and we will glance through its doorway eventually. But it is not where we are going. We are going down, to a plainer table, scrubbed pale by years of hard soap and harder hands, in a low-ceilinged room where the air smells of tallow candles and boiled cabbage and something faintly metallic that never quite airs out, no matter how many windows get propped open in summer. This is the servants' hall, and it is 9:30 at night, and the house above has not yet gone to bed. Maybe she is 19, this girl at the far end of the bench, her cap slightly askew because there has not been a spare minute since 5 that morning to fix it properly. Maybe she is a scullery maid, the lowest rung on a ladder so long and so rigid that she has never once spoken directly to the lady of the house, has in fact been trained specifically to disappear the moment that ladies' skirts come anywhere near a doorway she happens to be cleaning. Or maybe she's a little older, 23, 24, a kitchen maid who has been in service long enough to know exactly how many minutes she has before the housekeeper's bell will ring again, exactly how much bread she's allowed to take before someone notices, exactly which of the upper servants can be reasoned with and which cannot. Either way, she is hungry. Not dramatically, not in the way a novel would render it, with fainting and tears, just quietly, chronically hungry, the way you might be tired for a whole season without ever quite naming it, because naming it would not change anything, and there are more pressing things to think about, like whether the fish course went out correctly, and whether cook noticed the burnt corner on the second batch of rolls. Here is the detail that stops me every time I come back to this story, and I want to give it to you now, right at the start, so it can sit with you while everything else unfolds. The food this girl is about to eat tonight, this thin scrape of butter on yesterday's bread, this cup of tea gone lukewarm and grey with too much water and not enough leaf, was prepared in the very same kitchen, by the very same hands that spent the last 6 hours producing a dinner of 9 removes for the family upstairs. She cooked abundance all day. She will eat scarcity tonight. That is not a metaphor. That is simply how the house was built to work. It is the summer of 1883, and the house is somewhere in the English countryside, close enough to London that guests can arrive by afternoon train and be settled before dinner, far enough that the air still smells of cut hay and horse, rather than coal smoke. This is the height of what people at the time simply called the season, that long stretch from spring into late summer when the wealthy move between London townhouses and country estates in a kind of elaborate migration, hosting, and being hosted, each visit a small performance of taste and means. For the family who owns this house, the season means a full house of guests, a full slate of dinners, a calendar that reads like a campaign map. For the people who keep the house running, it means something else entirely. It means the hardest months of the year. I want to walk you through this world properly, because it is more layered than most of us imagine, and the layering matters. It is not simply upstairs and downstairs, though that is the shorthand everyone reaches for. Downstairs itself has its own upstairs and downstairs, its own hierarchy, so precise and so rigidly enforced that a scullery maid in 1883 would no more think of addressing the cook by her first name than the cook would think of sitting at the housekeeper's right hand uninvited. At the top of the servant world sits the butler, who runs the male staff and the household's formal operations, and the housekeeper, who runs everything female and everything domestic, the linens, the stores, the maids, the endless small economies of a house this size. Below them, the cook, who commands the kitchen with an authority that in some households rivals the housekeeper's own, because a bad cook can ruin a family's reputation in a single dinner party, and everyone knows it. Below the cook, the kitchen maid, who does the heavy preparatory work, the chopping and plucking and scraping that a cook of any standing would never touch herself. Below the kitchen maid, lowest of the low, the scullery maid who scours pots black with grease, hauls water, blacks the stoves, and eats her meals more often than not standing up in the scullery itself because there genuinely is not time to sit. And then there are the maids who work above stairs rather than below. The housemaids who lay fires and empty grates and dust 1,000 small ornaments before the family is even awake. And above them again, closer to the family in daily proximity, though not necessarily in household rank, the lady's maid, who dresses the mistress of the house, arranges her hair and occupies a strange in-between position, neither quite servant in the way a scullery maid is servant, nor quite anything else. I mention all of this now because tonight's story moves through several of these women, and the differences between them, small as they might sound to us, were the entire architecture of their daily lives. What you ate, where you slept, how much you were paid, whether you had a half-day free on Sunday or worked straight through. All of it was decided by where you sat on this ladder, and the ladder did not bend for kindness or hard work. It bent occasionally for luck. The house itself, since I know you are picturing it, has perhaps 18 bedrooms above stairs and a household staff of around 14, which by the standards of the very grandest estates is modest, though by the standards of, say, a comfortable professional family in London, it would have seemed almost unimaginably large. There is a butler, a housekeeper, a cook, 2 kitchen maids, a scullery maid, 4 housemaids, a lady's maid for the mistress, a valet for the master, 2 footmen, and a hall boy who does whatever nobody else wants to do, which in practice means most things. 14 people living and working inside walls that also contain a family of 5 and, during the season, anywhere from 4 to 10 additional guests. The house does not stop. It cannot stop. A house like this one runs on the fiction that everything simply happens, that fires light themselves and meals appear and floors stay clean without any visible human effort at all, and maintaining that fiction is, itself, a form of labour so constant and so exhausting that most of the people performing it will spend the whole of their working lives inside it without ever once being thanked by name. Now let us slow down here for a moment, because this is the part of the story most documentaries skip entirely, and it is the part I find genuinely the most remarkable. Food in a house like this one was not simply available to servants in the way we might assume, some communal pot from which everyone helped themselves according to hunger. It was rationed. Precisely, deliberately, and according to rank, in a system so formalised that some households kept written records of exactly what each level of servant was entitled to, down to the ounce. The basic architecture worked something like this. The family upstairs ate first, and ate whatever the season and the budget and the occasion demanded, which during the season could mean 9 or 10 courses at a formal dinner, game brought in from the estate's own shoot, fish packed in ice and sent up from the coast that same morning, French sauces that took a trained cook the better part of a day to prepare correctly, ices and creams kept cold in a dedicated ice house that was itself a small architectural marvel, stocked every winter with blocks cut from the lake and packed in straw to last through summer. After the family finished, whatever remained from their table, and there was often a great deal remaining, because a 9-course dinner for 6 people generates significant leftovers, went to the upper servants first, the butler, the housekeeper, the cook, the lady's maid, the valet. These were the senior staff, and they ate remarkably well by any standard of the era, sometimes better than a modest professional family managed on an ordinary evening. Proper cuts of meat, good bread, real tea, brewed strong, not stretched. Wine, occasionally, if the butler judged it appropriate and the cellar could spare it. Only after the upper servants had taken their portion did what remained pass down to the lower servants, the kitchen maids, the housemaids, the scullery maid, the hall boy. And by this point in the chain, what remained was, frankly, whatever was left, bread. Dripping, which is to say the fat rendered from roasting meat, saved and spread on bread in place of butter, which was too expensive to waste on the lower staff in any real quantity. Weak tea, the leaves used a second or even third time, the colour barely darker than the water itself. Watered milk, because fresh milk was expensive and a scullery maid's ration of it could be stretched considerably further if half the jug was simply topped up from the pump. Gruel, thin and often flavourless, served for breakfast because it was cheap and filling in the moment, even if it left a person hungry again within 2 hours. And whatever scraps came down from the family's table after the upper servants had already had their choice of it, which by dinner time on a busy evening might amount to very little indeed, a few cold potatoes, the bones of a joint with the good meat already carved away, the heel of a loaf. I want to be honest with you about something, because it would be easy to make this sound like simple cruelty, some deliberate villainy on the part of the family upstairs, and the truth is more complicated and in its way more troubling. Most families did not think about it at all. That is the detail that unsettles me the most, more than any single meal or any single hungry night. The rationing was not, in most households, a decision anyone made consciously at the dinner table. It was simply how things had always been done, inherited from house to house, generation to generation, a system so embedded in the ordinary running of an estate that it did not require cruelty to sustain it. It required only inattention. The family upstairs genuinely did not know, in any specific or troubled way, what the scullery maid had eaten that day. They did not ask. It was not their department, in the same way that the precise mechanism of the water pump was not their department. Someone else handled it. Someone else always handled it. Let me give this girl a name now, even though the name itself is invented. A composite the way most of the details in stories like this one have to be composite, stitched together from diaries and household account books, and the occasional surviving letter, because the women who lived this life mostly did not leave records of their own. They were too tired, most nights, to write anything down, and too aware, perhaps, that no one would think their days worth recording. So let us call her Sarah. Sarah is the scullery maid, 17 years old, the youngest girl in the household, and her day tonight, the one that ends with her at that plain table with her scrape of bread and dripping, began at 5 o'clock that morning, in the dark, in an attic room she shares with another maid, in a bed with a thin mattress stuffed with straw that has gone hard and lumpy in the places where 2 bodies have slept for 2 years running. 5 o'clock. No one wakes Sarah gently. There is no soft knock, no cup of tea brought up, none of the small comforts that will be extended to the family upstairs when they wake. Hours from now, to a fire already lit and hot water already carried up, and curtains already drawn. Sarah wakes because she has trained her own body to wake, the way you might train a dog, through repetition and consequence, because being late even by 10 minutes means the whole chain of the morning falls behind, and a household running behind by breakfast has a way of staying behind all day, and everyone downstairs feels the strain of it, and everyone downstairs knows exactly whose fault it was. She dresses in the cold, in the dark, careful not to wake the other girl, though the other girl will be up herself within the half hour. Cold water from a jug that was filled the night before and has sat all night in an unheated room, so cold enough by morning that washing her face with it feels less like comfort and more like a small punishment she has simply learned to absorb without complaint. Her uniform, a coarse print dress for the early dirty work of the day, an apron over it, thick and already stained no matter how carefully it was scrubbed the evening before, because grease from the pots does not fully come out of cotton, not with the soap available to a household of this era, not ever, really. Down the back stairs, the narrow ones, the ones built specifically so that servants moving through the house could never be seen from the main staircase or the family's corridors, a piece of architecture so deliberate it still startles people when they see it preserved in surviving houses today. 2 separate staircases, sometimes 3, built into the same structure so that 2 entirely different households, the served and the serving, could move through the same walls without their paths ever crossing. By 5:30, Sarah is in the kitchen, and the kitchen is already somehow alive. The range has to be lit and brought up to heat before anything else can happen, and this alone is a task that takes real skill, real physical effort, raking out yesterday's ash, laying kindling, coaxing a fire that has to burn at a specific, controllable temperature for hours because the whole day's cooking depends on it. Sarah's hands do this work before her mind is even fully awake, black with soot within minutes, and this is only the beginning. There is water to carry, heavy buckets of it, up from the pump in the yard, because a kitchen this size uses staggering quantities of water in a single day, for cooking, for washing, for the endless scouring of pots that will define most of Sarah's actual hours. There are vegetables to begin preparing for the day's meals, potatoes to peel, a task so constant and so repetitive that experienced kitchen staff developed a kind of unconscious speed at it, hands moving faster than thought. Breakfast for the servants themselves comes early and comes fast, snatched in the gaps between tasks, rather than sat down to properly, at least for the lower staff. For Sarah, this usually means a bowl of gruel, oatmeal cooked thin with water rather than milk, because milk is rationed carefully, and the lower servant's portion of it is small, stretched further with a splash more water than anyone upstairs would ever tolerate in their own tea. The gruel is not unpleasant exactly, it is simply not enough. It fills the stomach for perhaps 2 hours before the ache of hunger creeps back in, quiet at first, easy to ignore while there is work to distract from it, less easy to ignore by mid-morning, when the smell of the family's breakfast, proper eggs, good bacon, toast with real butter, drifts down from the warming dishes being prepared to go up. I find myself genuinely struck by this detail every time I sit with it. The smell. Sarah spends her entire working life inside the smell of food she will not eat. Bread baking, meat roasting, sauces reducing on the stove, rich with butter and wine and cream, the kind of smell that fills a kitchen and clings to hair and clothing long after the cooking is done. She breathes this air for 16 hours a day, and at the end of those 16 hours her own meal will contain almost none of it. By 7, the kitchen has its full complement of morning staff, and this is where I want to introduce you to 2 more women, because Sarah's story does not happen in isolation. There is Hannah, the senior kitchen maid, 24 years old, who has been in service since she was 13 and has worked her way up from scullery work herself, which means she remembers with a clarity that occasionally surfaces in small unexpected kindnesses exactly what it feels like to be the youngest and hungriest girl in the room. And there is Mrs. Pierce, the cook, a woman in her 50s who has run this particular kitchen for 11 years and who commands it with an authority that even the housekeeper, technically her superior in the household hierarchy, treats with a certain wary respect, because everyone in the house, upstairs and down, understands that Mrs. Pierce's skill is what keeps the family's reputation intact at every dinner party they host. Mrs. Pierce eats well. I want to say that plainly, without judgment, because her situation is part of what makes this whole system so revealing. As cook, she sits near the top of the servant hierarchy, and her food reflects it. Proper meat most days, not the scraps and trimmings the lower staff receive, but genuine cuts, sometimes taken directly from what she is preparing for the family. A taste here, a small extra portion there, entirely within her rights as the person who controls the kitchen. Real butter, not dripping. Tea brewed strong, the leaves fresh, not reused from an earlier pot. She does not go hungry, and she has not gone hungry in years, and there is no reason, within the logic of the world she inhabits, why she should feel any particular guilt about this. She earned her position through decades of hard, skilled labour, starting exactly where Sarah is starting now, and the system that now feeds her well is the same system she once suffered under. This is not hypocrisy, exactly. It is simply how the ladder works. Everyone who climbs it stops looking down eventually, not out of cruelty, but because looking down was never required of them once they reached the top. And yet, and this is the detail I keep circling back to, the one that complicates any simple story about villains and victims here, Mrs. Pierce, for all her comfort, for all the authority she wields with real and sometimes frightening precision when a dish comes out wrong, is not unkind to the girls beneath her. Not always, not even usually. There is a specific, careful mercy she extends quietly, without ceremony, that we will come back to later in this story, because it matters, and because it is the kind of detail that gets lost entirely if we only tell this history as a story of oppression, without also telling it as a story of the small human choices people made inside a system they did not build and could not individually dismantle. Let me take you upstairs now briefly, because you cannot understand the weight of what happens below without seeing, plainly, what is happening above at the very same hour. Tonight's dinner, because there is a dinner tonight, has been planned for the better part of a week, discussed between the mistress of the house and Mrs. Pierce, in a conversation that treated the menu with something close to the seriousness of a military briefing. 9 removes. That is the term the era used, removes, meaning courses, though the word carries a slightly different sense, the idea of one elaborate presentation being removed from the table and replaced by the next, an entire choreography of dishes arriving and departing in a specific, unbending order. The meal begins with soup, likely a clear consommé requiring hours of careful clarification, egg whites whisked into stock and slowly simmered to draw out every trace of cloudiness until the liquid runs perfectly clear, a technique that demands real skill and real patience, and that will be consumed by the guests in a matter of minutes, without a single one of them likely considering the hours of work behind it. After the soup, fish, packed that morning in ice and sent up from the coast by the earliest train, poached in a court bouillon and served with a delicate sauce built on butter and reduced wine, a sauce that alone might use more butter than Sarah will see in a month of her own rationed meals. Then an entree, perhaps sweetbreads or a delicate fricassee, followed by the main remove, likely game since it is the estate's own shoot providing the meat and there is a particular pride taken in serving what the land itself produced. Pheasant or partridge, depending on the season, roasted precisely and dressed with a rich dark sauce built over hours from bones and wine and careful reduction. After the main remove comes a course of vegetables prepared with a formality that would strike us now as almost absurd. Asparagus dressed in hollandaise, a butter and egg sauce whisked over gentle heat until it emulsifies into something silken and rich, requiring a cook's full attention for the entire process because it can split, ruin itself entirely in a matter of seconds of inattention. Then a sweet course or several, ices chilled in the estate's own ice house, creams set with gelatin and flavoured with vanilla pods that travelled from halfway across the world, a savoury course to close the meal in the English fashion, and finally fruit and nuts, presented in an elaborate silver epergne at the centre of the table, more decorative than functional by this point in the meal, since most guests will be too full to eat much of it. Here is the arithmetic I want you to sit with for a moment. This meal, prepared largely by Mrs. Pierce and Hannah, with Sarah handling the endless unglamorous labour beneath them, the peeling, the scouring, the fetching, the plucking of the very birds that will be served as the main remove, will be consumed by perhaps 8 or 10 people over the course of roughly 2 hours. The labour behind it across the whole kitchen staff runs closer to 60 or 70 person-hours when you add together everyone's contribution across the day, and when it is finished, when the family and their guests have withdrawn to the drawing room for coffee and conversation, the very same kitchen that produced all of this abundance will feed its own staff a meal built almost entirely from what remains, in an order determined not by hunger or need but by rank. I do not say this to make villains of the family upstairs, and I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to flatten this story into something simpler than it actually was. The mistress of this house is not, by the standards of her era, unusually cruel. She pays her wages reasonably promptly. She does not, so far as any surviving record suggests, deliberately starve her staff out of malice. She simply does not think about it in the specific, concrete way that would require imagining Sarah's actual dinner, Sarah's actual hunger, Sarah's actual body carrying 16 hours of labour on gruel and watered milk and a scrape of bread. The system does the thinking for her. It always has. That is in some ways the most quietly devastating part of the whole arrangement, more devastating than any single act of unkindness could be, because it means no one specific person ever has to feel responsible for it, and so no one specific person ever has much reason to change it. Now, let us slow down here for a moment, because I want to talk honestly about what this actually did to the bodies of the women living it. Not in the abstract, statistical way history sometimes flattens suffering into numbers, but in the specific, physical way that a body actually experiences 16 hours of hard labor on a diet, built almost entirely of bread, fat, and weak tea. The medical understanding of nutrition in 1883 was, by our standards, extremely limited. Vitamins would not even be identified as a scientific concept until the early 20th century, decades away still. Doctors of this era understood, in a general sense, that certain foods built strength and others did not, that meat and eggs and fresh vegetables produced healthier bodies than bread and fat alone. But the precise mechanisms, the specific deficiencies, the reasons why a diet like Sarah's would slowly and steadily undermine a young woman's health were simply not part of the medical vocabulary available at the time. And yet the effects were visible, well documented, even if the causes were not fully understood. Household staff of this era, particularly the lower servants on the most restricted diets, showed markedly higher rates of what contemporary observers called general debility, a catch-all term covering exhaustion, weakness, frequent minor illness, poor healing from small injuries, and a kind of chronic tiredness that never seemed to lift no matter how much a person slept, if indeed they got enough sleep to test the theory at all. Fainting was common enough among kitchen and scullery staff that it barely warranted comment in household diaries and account books from the period, mentioned in passing the way we might mention someone catching a cold. A scullery maid collapsing over a sink of dishes after a long stretch without proper food was not treated as an emergency requiring investigation into her diet or her working conditions. It was treated as an inconvenience, a delay in the day's work, something to be managed with a moment's rest and a splash of water to the face before returning to the task at hand. There are surviving accounts, preserved in the papers, of a few reform-minded observers who took an interest in servants' welfare later in the century, describing exactly this pattern. Girls who fainted regularly, who suffered from what we would now likely recognize as anemia, iron deficiency compounded by inadequate protein and inadequate rest, who developed chilblains in winter from poor circulation and inadequate warmth, whose hands cracked and bled from the combination of cold water, harsh soap, and simple malnutrition slowing the body's own capacity to heal itself. I want to be honest with you about something else too, because it matters and because it is easy to let it slide past unremarked. The exhaustion these women carried was not simply about hunger, though hunger was central to it. It was compounded relentlessly by hours. A 16-hour working day, 5 in the morning until 9 or 10 at night, 6 days a week, with perhaps half a day free on Sunday if the household's needs allowed for it, which during the season, with guests constantly arriving and departing, they frequently did not. This is a schedule that would be recognized today as extreme even in the most demanding professions, and it was carried in Sarah's case by a 17-year-old body that had not yet finished growing, fueled by perhaps 1,200 to 1,500 calories a day of largely nutrient-poor food, when the physical demands of the work alone likely required closer to 3,000. The mathematics of it, when you actually sit down and do the mathematics, are genuinely stark. And yet this was not considered remarkable at the time. It was simply how service worked, how it had always worked. A system so normalized that the girls living inside it rarely framed their own exhaustion as injustice. They framed it, when they framed it at all, as simply the nature of the work, the price of a roof and a wage and a position that, however hard, was still, in the calculus of the era, considerably better than the alternatives available to a working-class girl with few other paths open to her. That is perhaps the detail that unsettles me most, more than the hunger itself. Not that the system was cruel, though it was, but that the cruelty was so thoroughly absorbed into the ordinary texture of daily life that almost no one, including the women suffering under it, thought to name it as cruelty at all. And yet, Here is where the story turns gently towards something I think you will find rather lovely, because for all the hardship of this world, the women inside it were not simply passive vessels for suffering. They found ways, small and quiet and constant, to push back against a system that gave them almost no other avenue for resistance. I want to tell you about these small rebellions now, because they matter, because they are the part of this history that gets lost most easily, and because I think there is something genuinely admirable in the ingenuity of it. The most common form of quiet resistance was simple pilfering, though that word makes it sound more criminal than it usually felt to women doing it. A pat of butter, folded into a scrap of paper and tucked into an apron pocket during the chaos of dinner preparation, when Mrs. Pierce's attention was fixed entirely on the sauce reducing on the stove and not on the exact weight of the butter dish. A spoonful of sugar, taken from the household stores while restocking the pantry, small enough that it would never be missed against the quantities used in the family's desserts, significant enough, hoarded over weeks, to sweeten a girl's own tea for once, properly, the way she remembered her mother sweetening it before she went into service. Meat scraps, the trimmings and small cuts that would otherwise go to the household's dogs or into the stock pot, quietly set aside, wrapped, carried up to the attic room at the end of the night. There is a specific detail from household account books and later servant memoirs that I find genuinely moving, and I want to share it with you carefully. Many maids kept small tins in their bedrooms, biscuit tins usually, repurposed once their original contents were long gone, hidden under a floorboard or at the back of a shared wardrobe, where they stored these small stolen comforts, a twist of sugar, a heel of cheese, sometimes on a good week, a proper slice of meat, saved from a Sunday when the family's leftovers had been unusually generous. These tins were not treasure troves in any real sense. They held small amounts, modest amounts, nothing that would have registered as significant loss to the household's overall accounts. But to the girl who owned the tin, they represented something considerably larger than their contents, a small margin of control in a life that offered almost none, a private reserve against the worst nights, the ones where dinner service ran especially long and her own meal, by the time she finally sat down to it, felt thinner than usual, a tiny secret proof that she was not entirely at the mercy of the system that fed her. Trading was common too, quiet transactions between the lower staff that the upper servants either did not notice or, in some households, chose not to notice. A housemaid who found the bread and dripping genuinely unbearable one particular evening might trade her portion for a scullery maid's slightly larger share of cold meat, an exchange that cost the household nothing and mattered enormously to the two women involved. These trades ran on trust, on the kind of small daily intimacy that develops between people who share a bed of straw and a 16-hour working day, and very little else in the way of comfort. They were not formalized. There was no ledger, no system beyond memory and reciprocity, one girl remembering that another had covered for her the previous week, and returning the favor now, in food, in silence, in the small currency available to people who had almost nothing else to trade. There was a code too, unwritten but absolutely binding, among the female staff of a household like this one, and it centered on protection. If a girl was caught with something in her apron pocket that she should not have had, the response from the other women around her was almost never to expose her. Quite the opposite. There are accounts, again preserved mostly through the diaries and later recollections of women who had been in service as girls, of entire kitchens closing ranks around a maid caught with a stolen crust or a hidden piece of cheese, offering explanations on her behalf, absorbing small blame themselves, doing whatever was necessary to keep the punishment from landing with its full weight. I think about this a great deal, actually, the specific mechanics of that loyalty, because it tells you something important about how these women understood their own situation. They did not, for the most part, see the girl who stole a piece of butter as doing something wrong in any moral sense. They saw her as doing something necessary, something any of them might need to do themselves on a different night, and the instinct to protect her was not really about protecting an individual so much as protecting the fragile, unofficial system of small mercies that made their collective life bearable. If one girl was punished harshly enough, made an example of, the whole quiet economy of trading and hiding and looking the other way might collapse, and everyone would be worse off for it. So they protected each other, not out of some abstract sense of sisterhood, though that existed too, but out of a shared practical understanding that their survival in the fullest sense of that word depended on solidarity that the household hierarchy actively discouraged and never once acknowledged. The punishments, when discovery did happen despite everyone's best efforts, could be severe. Dismissal without a character reference was the worst of it, and it was genuinely devastating, because a servant's character, the written reference from a previous employer describing her honesty and competence, was essentially the only credential she had. Without one, finding another position anywhere near respectable became extraordinarily difficult, and the alternatives available to a dismissed servant girl in 1883 were bleak in ways that hardly need spelling out. This is why the code of protection mattered so much, why it was maintained with such quiet seriousness. A court girl was not simply facing an uncomfortable conversation with the housekeeper, she was potentially facing the collapse of her entire livelihood, her entire future, over a piece of bread she had taken because she was hungry in a house full of food she had cooked with her own hands. Which brings us back to Mrs. Pierce and to the specific mercy I promised to tell you about earlier, because I think it belongs here, in among all of this, as a kind of counterweight. Mrs. Pierce, as I mentioned, ate well and had authority over the entire kitchen, and by most accounts of women who occupied her position across various households of the era, cooks of her standing could be strict, sometimes harshly so, particularly when a dish went wrong or a girl's carelessness threatened to embarrass the household in front of guests. But strictness in the working hours did not always translate to coldness in the small private moments that occurred around the edges of the day, and this is where I want to tell you about Sarah again, specifically because there is a particular kind of quiet gesture that shows up in slightly different forms across servant memoirs from this whole period. On the nights when dinner service ran especially long, when the fish course was late or a sauce split and had to be remade under pressure and the whole kitchen moved through the evening at something close to a controlled panic, Mrs. Pierce had a habit, according to the pattern these accounts describe, of setting something aside near the stove, not announced, not offered directly, simply left where a particular girl, the youngest, the most obviously exhausted, would find it during a brief lull. A heel of proper bread still warm from the oven, spread already with real butter rather than dripping, a small cut of meat trimmed from the joint before it went up, more than the girl's official ration would have allowed, but not so much that anyone counting the joint upstairs would ever notice its absence. Nothing was said about it. The girl did not thank her aloud, because thanking her aloud would have turned a private kindness into a public transaction, would have required Mrs. Pierce to acknowledge, in front of the rest of the kitchen, that she was bending a system she was technically responsible for enforcing. It simply happened quietly and was quietly received, and both women understood exactly what had passed between them without either one needing to name it. I find something genuinely moving in that image. The warm bread left by the stove, the silence around it, this kindness having to travel in disguise simply to exist at all within a system that offered it no official space. It tells you something true about how people actually behave inside structures of inequality, which is rarely as simple as villains and victims. Mrs. Pierce benefited from the system that underfed Sarah. She was not in any meaningful sense fighting against that system, and yet within the small margin of authority she personally controlled, the discretion over exactly how much bread went into a particular loaf, exactly how a joint was trimmed before it left her kitchen, she made a choice night after night, quietly, to soften what she could not undo. That is not heroism exactly, but it is not nothing either. It is the specific, human-sized kindness that survives even inside systems designed without any room for it. And I think it deserves to be remembered alongside the hunger, not instead of it, but alongside it. because both things were equally true of this world at the very same time. Let us go back now to that table, the one we started with, because I want to walk you through the actual meal in more detail, the specific foods, because I think the specificity matters more than any general description could. 9:30, the servants' hall. The lower staff finally sitting down to their own dinner after the family's meal has been cleared and the washing up has begun in earnest. Bread and dripping was the absolute foundation of the lower servants' diet, appearing at nearly every meal in one form or another. Dripping, for anyone unfamiliar with the term, is the fat rendered from roasting meat, collected and saved rather than discarded, and in a household kitchen producing roasted joints regularly for the family upstairs, there was a steady supply of it. Spread on bread, it provided calories certainly, and a kind of rich, savoury flavour that made plain bread considerably more palatable than it would otherwise have been. But it provided almost nothing else nutritionally, none of the protein of actual meat, none of the vitamins of fresh vegetables, simply fat and starch, meal after meal, day after day, for years at a time for a girl like Sarah. Tea was the other constant, though calling it tea slightly overstates what the lower servants actually received. The leaves used for the family's tea upstairs were often reused for a second brewing below stairs, sometimes even a third, meaning the lower servants' tea grew progressively weaker as it travelled down the household hierarchy, until what reached a scullery maid's cup might be barely coloured water with the faintest suggestion of tannin. Milk, when it appeared at all, was watered, sometimes quite significantly, a household economy so common that servants of the era developed their own private vocabulary for it, referring to particularly diluted milk as blue milk, for the faint bluish cast the watering gave it. Sugar was rationed carefully too, doled out in small specific quantities rather than left freely available, which is precisely why a stolen spoonful hoarded in a bedroom tin represented such a genuine, if modest, luxury. Breakfast, as I mentioned, usually meant gruel or porridge cooked thin, sometimes supplemented with a small amount of bread, though rarely with anything approaching the eggs and proper bacon and buttered toast that would go up to the family's breakfast room at the very same hour. The midday meal, when there was time for one, which during the busiest stretches of the season was not always guaranteed, might include a small portion of meat, usually the least desirable cuts or the trimmings left over from preparing the family's dinner, boiled or stewed into something that stretched further than a proper roast would have. Vegetables appeared, but rarely the delicate, carefully prepared asparagus and fresh peas that graced the upstairs table. The lower servants ate the cabbage, the turnips, the potatoes, plain and boiled, filling but nutritionally limited, particularly when prepared as they often were by boiling for far longer than necessary, a method that stripped away much of whatever vitamin content the vegetables originally held. And then dinner itself, the meal we are watching Sarah eat right now, at 9:30, exhausted, her feet aching in a way that has become so constant she has almost stopped registering it as pain, simply as the ordinary condition of being upright at this hour. Bread, dripping, whatever cold scraps came down from the family's table after the upper servants had already taken their share. Tonight perhaps a few spoonfuls of vegetables gone slightly cold, the carcass of one of the birds with the good meat already carved cleanly away by Mrs. Pierce herself for the upper servants' plates, leaving Sarah and the other lower staff to pick at whatever remained clinging to the bone. It is not nothing. I want to be fair to the historical reality here, because it would be inaccurate to suggest these women were literally starving in the acute sense. But it is thin, it is monotonous, it is nutritionally poor, in ways that compounded, slowly and invisibly, over months and years of service, and it stands in a contrast so stark against the meal these same hands prepared just hours earlier, that the gap between the two tables, upstairs and down, becomes almost impossible to fully comprehend once you have sat with the specifics of it as closely as we have tonight. I want to widen the lens a little now, because Sarah's story, real as it feels to us, is a composite drawn from a much wider pattern, and I think the wider pattern is worth sitting with too. Let me tell you about Alice, the senior housemaid in this same household, because her situation illustrates something slightly different, a version of the same hierarchy playing out along a different axis. Alice is 41 years old, and she has been in service since she was 12, which means she has spent nearly 30 years of her life inside households like this one, moving up slowly, painstakingly, from the very bottom rung to her current position as senior housemaid, a rank that sits comfortably above the kitchen and scullery staff, though still well below the upper servants like the housekeeper and the lady's maid. Her diet correspondingly sits somewhere in the middle too, better than Sarah's certainly. She is not eating gruel and dripping at every meal, but not remotely comparable to what Mrs. Pierce or the housekeeper enjoy either. A kind of permanent middle ground, adequate without ever quite being generous, sufficient to keep a body functioning without ever quite nourishing it the way 30 years of hard physical labour genuinely required. What strikes me most about Alice's story, when you sit with the arithmetic of it, is the sheer duration. Sarah, at 17, has perhaps a decade of this life ahead of her before, if she is fortunate, she marries or finds some other path out of service, or, if she is less fortunate, simply continues on this same trajectory for years longer than any of us would consider reasonable. Alice represents what that trajectory looks like when it runs its full course. Nearly 30 years of 16-hour days, nearly 30 years of a diet built primarily around bread, fat, and whatever the household's rank system permitted her at any given point in her career. 30 years of a body absorbing the slow, compounding cost of inadequate rest and inadequate nutrition, a cost that does not announce itself dramatically the way an acute illness might, but accumulates instead in smaller, quieter ways, joints that ache earlier than they should, a frame that looks by middle age considerably older than the calendar would suggest, a kind of permanent, low-grade fatigue that Alice herself would likely not even describe as fatigue anymore, because she has never in her entire adult life known any other way for her body to feel. And yet Alice does not complain. This is perhaps the detail that I find most quietly devastating of everything in this story, more than any single hungry night, more than any specific instance of unfairness. She does not complain, not because her situation does not warrant complaint, but because complaint within the world she inhabits carries genuine risk and offers essentially no possibility of remedy. The housemaid who complained too openly about her food, her hours, her wages, risked being labelled difficult, and a difficult servant, however skilled, however loyal, however long her service, could find herself without a position and without the character reference that made finding another one possible. So the complaint, if it exists at all, stays private, absorbed, folded into the same quiet endurance that defines nearly every woman we have discussed tonight. Decades of it, an entire working life of it, carried without complaint, not because the burden was light, but because there was, within the world as it existed in 1883, genuinely nowhere for the complaint to go. Of course, that is not the whole story of who ate well and who did not in a house like this one, because rank ran along more than one axis, and I think it is worth pausing on the lady's maid specifically, because her position complicates the simple picture I have been painting so far. The lady's maid in this household, whom we might call Miss Griggs, since ladies' maids were commonly addressed by their surnames alone, without the honorific title reserved for actual ladies, occupies a strange and genuinely unusual space within the servant hierarchy. She works in the closest physical proximity to the family of nearly anyone in the household, dressing the mistress each morning and each evening, managing an extraordinarily intimate portion of her employer's daily life, privy to conversations and confidences that the housekeeper or the butler would rarely if ever hear. This proximity translated in practice into privileges that the rest of the lower and middle servant ranks did not enjoy. Miss Griggs eats considerably better than Sarah or even Alice, closer in quality to what the upper servants receive, sometimes taking her meals separately from the general servants' hall entirely, a small private courtesy that both marked her elevated status and reinforced, quietly but unmistakably, the distance between her and the girls doing the harder physical labour below stairs. She might be given cast-off items of clothing from her mistress, small gifts, occasional treats brought back from London, privileges that had nothing to do with any formal wage structure and everything to do with personal favour, the kind of favour that could evaporate instantly if the relationship between maid and mistress soured, leaving Miss Griggs, for all her relative comfort, in a position that was ultimately just as precarious as anyone else's in the house, dependent entirely on the goodwill of a single person who owed her nothing beyond her wages. I mention this because it complicates any tidy story we might want to tell about hierarchy and hunger in a house like this one. It was not simply upstairs eating well and downstairs eating poorly. It was a whole graduated system, rank folding into rank, with real and meaningful differences at every level, and a woman's position on that ladder determining, with almost mathematical precision, exactly how much food reached her plate, and exactly what quality that food would be. Miss Griggs, comfortable as she was relative to Sarah, would herself have looked with a certain wariness at the housekeeper's authority, would have understood herself as meaningfully beneath the cook in some respects and meaningfully above her in others, would have carried her own small set of anxieties about status and security that, while different in degree from Sarah's, were not entirely different in kind. There is a document, a survey of household staff conditions conducted by reform-minded observers later in the 19th century, that attempted to systematically record exactly this kind of graduated inequality across a range of English households. The findings, though compiled a decade or more after our story tonight, describe a pattern that would have been entirely recognizable to Sarah and Alice and Miss Griggs alike. Servants at the bottom of household hierarchies consistently reported diets dominated by bread, fat, and weak tea, with meat appearing rarely and in small quantities, generally the least desirable cuts. Servants in the middle ranks reported modest but adequate diets, sufficient to sustain health under ordinary circumstances but offering little margin during periods of unusually demanding work. Senior servants, cooks, butlers, housekeepers, and favoured personal attendants like ladies' maids and valets reported diets that in some cases exceeded in variety and quality what a comfortable middle-class family might have eaten on an ordinary evening. The gap between the bottom and the top of this internal servant hierarchy was, by some measures documented in this survey, nearly as wide as the gap between the servants generally and the families they served. The season made everything harder, and I think it is worth explaining exactly why, because the intensity of these months was not simply a matter of more work in some general sense. It was a specific, compounding pressure that touched every part of the household's operation, including, and perhaps especially, the food available to the lower staff. During the quieter months, autumn and winter, when the family might spend weeks at a time with no guests at all, simply managing their own household routine, the kitchen's rhythm slowed considerably. There was time to breathe between meals. There was occasionally a genuine surplus, since the family's own consumption on an ordinary evening was modest compared to what a full dinner party required, and that surplus, more often than not, found its way down to the lower servants in slightly more generous portions than the strict rationing system technically demanded. But during the season from roughly April through August, the house rarely stood still. Guests arrived for weekend visits that might stretch to a full week or more. Dinner parties followed one another in quick succession, sometimes several in a single week, each one requiring the full elaborate production we discussed earlier, the multiple removes, the delicate sauces, the ices kept perfectly set despite the summer heat. The kitchen staff worked longer, harder, under more sustained pressure, and here is the detail that I find genuinely striking. The rationing system did not loosen to compensate for the additional labour. If anything, it tightened, because a household running at full capacity, feeding guests as well as family, watched its food budget more carefully, not less, and the burden of that careful watching fell, as it always did, hardest on the servants with the least power to object to it. This meant that Sarah's hardest working weeks of the entire year, the weeks when her body most desperately needed proper fuel to sustain 16 and sometimes 18-hour days, were also, paradoxically, the weeks when the food reaching her own table was thinnest and least reliable, because every available resource, every good cut of meat, every fresh vegetable, Every careful hour of a cook's attention was being funneled upward toward the family's table, toward the dinner parties that mattered so enormously to the household's social standing. The exhaustion compounded on itself in a way that a modern understanding of nutrition would recognize immediately as unsustainable, and that the era's own limited medical knowledge could only observe vaguely as general debility, without ever quite tracing the cause back to its obvious and specific source. Let us go up to the attic now, because that is where Sarah's day actually ends, and I want you to sit with this room for a while because there is something in its plainness that I think deserves real attention rather than a quick summary. The attic rooms of a house like this one sit above the main bedrooms, tucked under the roofline where the ceiling slopes sharply enough that a grown woman can only stand fully upright in the center of the room. There is no fireplace here, no source of heat beyond whatever warmth rises, faintly, from the chimneys passing through the walls from the rooms below, which in winter is barely enough to keep the frost from forming on the inside of the small window, and in summer turns the room into something close to an oven, airless and close, the heat of the whole day's cooking rising up through the house and pooling here at the very top, with nowhere left to go. 2 beds, narrow, iron-framed, with thin mattresses stuffed with straw, or, in slightly better appointed households, a cheaper grade of horsehair, worn down over years of use into hollows that roughly match the shape of the bodies that sleep in them night after night, a washstand with a chipped basin, a small chest for what few possessions a servant girl actually owns, which for someone like Sarah amounts to perhaps 2 changes of uniform, a Sunday dress for her rare free afternoons, a comb, a small mirror, and, tucked at the very back, behind a folded shawl, the biscuit tin we spoke of earlier, with its hoarded scraps of sugar and its careful, private hope of something better than tomorrow's gruel. Sarah climbs these stairs at 9:30, after the servants' hall dinner, after the last of the washing up, after the kitchen has finally gone quiet for the night. She is tired in a way that goes beyond ordinary tiredness, a heaviness that settles into her legs and her lower back and the base of her skull. And I want to be honest with you because this detail matters. She does not lie awake worrying about her circumstances tonight. There is no energy left for that kind of reflection. She simply sleeps hard and fast, the exhausted collapse of a body that has given everything it has to give for 16 straight hours, and has nothing left over for anything as complicated as feeling sorry for itself. And yet the sleep itself is not particularly restful, not in the way we might hope. The room is too hot in summer, too cold in winter. The bed is too narrow and too hard to allow for the kind of deep, restorative rest that a body recovering from real physical labor genuinely needs. And there is always, somewhere in the back of her mind, the knowledge that morning comes at 5, whether she is rested or not, whether her body has actually recovered from yesterday's labor or not, because the house does not pause to ask. I want to tell you about a specific night now, not tonight exactly, but one very much like it, drawn from the pattern that recurs across so many servant accounts of this era, that it has become in its way almost a genre unto itself within the historical record. It is late July, the height of the season, and the household has hosted 3 dinner parties in the space of 9 days, each one requiring the same relentless choreography of preparation, service and cleanup that we have already walked through together tonight. Sarah has been on her feet since 5 each morning, and by the 3rd evening, something in her body simply gives out. It happens quietly, the way these things usually did. She is at the scullery sink, elbow deep in greasy water, scouring the last of the copper pots from that evening's sauce work, and the room tilts, gently at first, then sharply, and the next thing she is aware of is the cold stone floor against her cheek, and Hannah's voice, urgent but controlled, calling for someone to fetch water. She has fainted. This is not, as I mentioned earlier, treated as a crisis. Mrs. Pierce, informed of the incident, allows Sarah perhaps 20 minutes to sit with her head between her knees and a cup of water before returning to work, because the pots still need finishing and there is no one else free to finish them. There is no discussion of what might have caused the fainting spell, no examination of her diet, no adjustment to her workload in the days that follow. She is given a short rest, and then she is expected to continue, and she does continue, because there is genuinely no alternative available to her that does not risk her position entirely. I find myself wanting to sit with this moment a little longer than the historical record itself typically allows, because I think it deserves more attention than a single line in a household diary usually gives it. A 17-year-old girl, malnourished by any modern standard, working 16 hours a day in a hot, physically demanding environment, faints from simple exhaustion and inadequate fuel, and the response of everyone around her, not out of cruelty but out of the sheer grinding normalcy of the situation, is to give her 20 minutes and send her back to the sink. This was not considered remarkable. This was Tuesday. This was for thousands of girls across thousands of households just like this one. Simply what service looked like at the height of the season, in the summer of 1883, in a country that considered itself, by every measure available to it, the most advanced and most civilized nation on earth. The medical literature of the period, when it addressed servant health at all, tended to frame these episodes in vague, almost apologetic language. General debility, nervous exhaustion, weakness of constitution, phrases that located the problem somewhere inside the individual servant rather than in the conditions producing her collapse. It would take decades, well into the 20th century, before medical science developed the vocabulary and the understanding to name what was actually happening to bodies like Sarah's, the specific deficiencies, the compounding effects of inadequate protein and inadequate rest on a body still doing the hard physical labor of a full-grown adult. In 1883, there was simply no framework available for understanding her collapse as anything other than a personal failing, a weakness to be managed rather than a condition to be treated, and this absence of understanding, more than any single act of unkindness, is perhaps the truest villain of this entire story. Here is the part nobody talks about when they tell this history, and I want to give it real space tonight, because it is one of my favourite details in this entire story. The kind of thing that makes the whole system feel human again rather than simply grim. There was a night, not long before the one we have been sitting with, when a younger scullery maid, a girl of 15 who had only been in service a few months, was caught by the housekeeper with a wedge of cheese tucked into the pocket of her apron, cheese that had clearly been taken from the pantry stores rather than distributed as part of any authorized ration. The housekeeper in a household like this one held real authority over dismissal, and a girl caught stealing, even something as modest as a wedge of cheese, could reasonably expect to lose her position over it, particularly this early in her service, before she had built up any real credit of trust or loyalty within the household. What happened instead, according to the pattern that shows up again and again in the surviving accounts of women who lived through arrangements like this one, is that Hannah stepped forward and told the housekeeper that she herself had given the girl permission to take a small piece of cheese, that it had been set aside deliberately as a reward for particularly careful work earlier that week. This was not true, but it was delivered with enough calm authority, enough of Hannah's own accumulated credibility within the household, that the housekeeper, though clearly skeptical, chose not to pursue the matter further. The younger girl kept her position. The cheese was never mentioned again. I want to be careful here not to overstate what this kind of intervention actually cost Hannah, because it did cost her something, vouching for another servant's honesty, particularly in a situation where the housekeeper's suspicion was reasonably well-founded, put Hannah's own credibility at risk. If the pattern had repeated, if the younger girl had been caught again soon after, Hannah's word would have carried considerably less weight the second time, and her own position in the household's estimation would have suffered along with it. She took this risk anyway, not because the two women were close friends in any deep sense. They had known each other only a few months at that point, but because of exactly the unwritten code we discussed earlier, the shared understanding among the female staff that protecting one another from a system that offered them almost no protection of its own was simply what you did, what you owed to the women working beside you. because you might need the same protection extended to you before the year was out. Let me widen out again for a moment, because I think it is worth understanding what the household manuals and etiquette guides of the era actually said about all of this, since they reveal in their own way just how thoroughly this system of rationed inequality had become normalized within respectable society. There is a well-known household management guide from this period, extraordinarily popular among middle and upper-class women running households of their own, that devotes considerable attention to the precise management of servants, their wages, their duties, their conduct, and, notably, their food. The guide is remarkably specific about servant wages across various positions, and equally specific in its own quieter way about the expectation that servant meals should be simple and economical, prepared where possible from the household's own leftovers rather than purchased separately. A piece of advice offered not as cruelty but as sound domestic economy, the kind of practical household management that a sensible mistress was expected to master. This is, I think, the detail that captures the whole system most precisely. The rationing of servants' food was not hidden or secret. It was published openly in guides that circulated through thousands of respectable households, discussed as a simple matter of household budgeting, no more morally fraught than deciding how much coal to order for the winter. The women who ran these households, women like the mistress upstairs in our own story tonight, were not secretly aware of some injustice they chose to ignore. They were following advice that their entire social world considered ordinary, sensible, even virtuous, the mark of a well-managed household rather than a poorly managed conscience. And what were the alternatives for a girl like Sarah if service itself became unbearable? This is worth sitting with honestly, because it explains a great deal about why so few servants of this era pushed back openly against conditions that, from our vantage point more than a century later, look so obviously unjust. Domestic service, for all its hardship, offered something that few other paths available to a working-class girl in 1883 could match: a roof over her head, however cramped, a wage, however modest, paid with reasonable reliability, and a position that carried at least some measure of social respectability compared to the alternatives. Factory work, increasingly common by this period, offered longer hours in many cases and dangerous conditions, and wages that, while sometimes higher in raw terms, came without the roof and the food that service provided as part of the arrangement. Agricultural labour was seasonal, unreliable, and paid even less. The workhouse loomed always at the very bottom of the ladder, a fate every working-class family knew to fear and to avoid at almost any cost. Service, in other words, however hard, was not the worst option available to Sarah. It was, by the brutal calculus of her era and her class, one of the better ones, which tells you something quietly devastating about the actual range of choices available to a working-class girl in Victorian England, a range so narrow, so uniformly difficult, that 16-hour days on bread and dripping represented, genuinely, one of the more favourable outcomes she might reasonably hope for. Let me take you somewhere quieter for a while, because I think you have earned a slower stretch of this story, and because I want you to sit inside this house at an hour when nothing much is happening at all, which is in its own way just as revealing as the busiest dinner service. It is 4 a.m, deep winter, months after the summer evening we began with, and the house is utterly still. Snow has been falling since before midnight, soft and steady, and it has settled thick across the roof and the stable yard and the long gravel drive that sweeps up to the front entrance, muffling every sound the way heavy snow always does, so that even the wind, when it moves at all, seems to arrive at the windows with less voice than usual. Inside, every fire has burned down to embers except the kitchen range, which is never allowed to go entirely cold, banked carefully each night by whichever kitchen maid closes up, so that come morning there will be enough heat still living in the coals to bring the fire back to full strength quickly, without the hour of coaxing a completely cold range would otherwise require. Sarah is not awake yet. It is still an hour before her body, trained now through months of repetition, will rouse itself in the attic room above, but I want you to sit here with me a moment anyway in this particular quiet, because I think there is something worth noticing in it. The house at 4 a.m. in deep winter is for a few hours genuinely at rest, upstairs and down both, the only true stretch of the whole day when the elaborate machinery of service and status and rank simply stops turning, when the family sleeps under down and the servants sleep under thin blankets, and neither group is, for these few hours, actively serving or being served. There is something almost peaceful in it if you let yourself feel it that way. A fragile, temporary equality that exists only because everyone, for once, is unconscious. It will not last. In less than an hour, the kitchen maid on early duty will be up, coaxing that banked fire back to full heat, and the whole apparatus of the day will begin assembling itself again. Water carried, ranges heated, fires laid in a dozen bedrooms before their occupants stir. But for these few hours in the deep hush of a snowbound winter night, the house simply exists, without hierarchy, without service, without the endless careful choreography of who eats what and who serves whom, and I find something worth sitting with in that image, the whole elaborate machine of Victorian domestic life, resting briefly under snow. Winter changed the rhythm of the whole household, and it is worth understanding how, because the picture I have given you so far has focused mostly on the intensity of the summer season, and winter offered its own particular version of hardship, quieter, less frantic, but in some ways just as demanding on a body already worn thin by inadequate food. The kitchen in winter faced a different set of pressures. Fresh vegetables became scarcer and more expensive, meaning the household relied more heavily on root vegetables held in storage since autumn. Potatoes and turnips and onions kept in a cool cellar, their nutritional value diminishing steadily the longer they sat. Meat, ironically, was sometimes more plentiful in winter, since this was the traditional season for slaughtering livestock that could not be economically fed through the cold months. But this abundance, as we have already discussed at length, flowed overwhelmingly toward the family's table and the upper servants, leaving the lower staff's rations largely unchanged in their fundamental thinness. The cold itself compounded everything. A body already running on inadequate fuel struggles considerably harder to maintain its own core temperature in an unheated attic room through a long winter night, and the chilblains and rheumatism that appear so consistently in the medical accounts of servant health from this era were, in significant part, simply the visible cost of asking chronically underfed bodies to also stay warm without adequate heating, adequate blankets, or adequate clothing. Sarah's hands by the depth of winter would likely have shown the characteristic redness and swelling of chilblains across her knuckles, a condition so common among servants of this era that it barely registered as noteworthy, simply one more small, constant discomfort layered onto all the others. Not every hour of this life was grim, and I want to be careful tonight not to leave you with only the weight of it, because that would not be honest to the fuller picture, and because I think there is real comfort, at this hour of your own night, in knowing that even inside genuine hardship, these women found moments of warmth and humour and something close to happiness. Let me tell you about a particular half hour, on a quiet evening in early autumn, when the pressure of the season had finally eased, and the family had gone up to London for a week, leaving the house briefly with no one to serve but itself. The servants' hall that evening was livelier than usual, with no formal dinner to prepare, no upstairs meal demanding the kitchen's full attention. The staff's own dinner arrived earlier, and, for once, in slightly more generous portions than the strict rationing normally allowed, because Mrs. P.S., with no family menu to plan around, had a little more freedom to use the household's provisions as she judged fit. There was proper meat that night, a good stew made from a joint that would otherwise have gone to waste with the family away, and something almost approaching ease settled over the table. Hannah told a story about a footman in her previous household who had, through a comedy of poor timing and worse luck, managed to drop an entire tray of soup directly into a duchess's lap during a formal dinner, and the way she told it, with small exaggerated gestures and a perfectly timed pause before the final detail, had even Alice laughing properly, the kind of real laughter that creases the whole face and takes a moment to recover from. Sarah, still the youngest at the table, still finding her footing in this world of hierarchy and hardship, laughed too. And for a few minutes, in the warm, ordinary glow of the kitchen fire, the differences in rank between them mattered rather less than the simple, shared pleasure of a good story told well among people who worked hard together and had, in their own way, come to genuinely like one another. This is the part of the story I think gets lost most easily when we tell this history only through the lens of hardship, and I want to name it plainly. These women were not simply victims moving through a system that oppressed them, though the system did oppress them in real and measurable ways. They were also fully and completely human beings capable of humor and affection and the particular pleasure of a story well told at the end of a long day. Their friendships were real. Their laughter was real. The quiet solidarity we discussed earlier, the protection extended to a girl caught stealing, the bread left warm by the stove, existed alongside genuine warmth between these women, not as some kind of consolation prize for their hardship, but as its own fully realized thing, a form of connection built inside difficulty rather than despite it. I find something worth admiring in that, honestly. The capacity of people, even under conditions this demanding, to build real relationships, real humor, real moments of ease, out of whatever small margins the day allowed them. It does not excuse the system that gave them so little margin to work with, but it does complicate the picture in a way I think matters, reminding us that the women in this story were never simply defined by their hunger, however central that hunger was to their daily experience. They were defined just as much by the particular way each of them met that hardship, with humor, with loyalty, with small private rebellions, with the specific and considerable skill they brought to work that the household above stairs would never think to properly credit them for. Let me widen the lens one more time, because I think the scale of this world deserves a moment of real context before we settle back into the smaller, more intimate details of Sarah's particular life. Domestic service in 1883 was not some small or marginal occupation. It was, by a considerable margin, the single largest category of employment for women in England, larger than factory work, larger than agricultural labour, larger than any other occupation available to working-class women of this era. Estimates from census records of the period suggest well over 1 million women working in domestic service across England and Wales, a number so large it is genuinely difficult to hold in your mind all at once. 1 million individual Sarahs, 1 million individual attic rooms, 1 million individual biscuit tins hidden behind folded shawls. And within that enormous population, the household we have been sitting inside tonight, with its 14 servants and its 18 bedrooms, sits somewhere in the comfortable upper middle range of household size. Neither the grandest establishment of the era, the truly vast estates that might employ 40 or 50 indoor staff, nor the more modest households of a single maid of all work serving a professional family in a London terrace house, expected to manage an entire home's worth of cleaning, cooking and service essentially alone. That single maid of all work in many ways occupied a position even harder than Sarah's, without the structure and support such as it was of a full servant hierarchy around her, without even the companionship of other women sharing the same hardship in the same attic room. Sarah, for all the genuine difficulty of her situation, at least has Hannah and Alice, and the particular protective warmth of a servants' hall full of women who understand exactly what her days contain. I mention the maid of all work specifically because her situation, multiplied across hundreds of thousands of modest households throughout England, represents perhaps the truest baseline of what domestic service actually meant for the vast majority of women who entered it. Grand houses like the one in our story tonight, with their elaborate hierarchies and their 9 remove dinners, were the exception rather than the rule, however much popular imagination and period drama tend to focus on precisely this kind of household. Most servants worked in smaller homes, for less wealthy families, doing a wider range of tasks with even less structure and even less of the specialized skill development that allowed a woman like Mrs. Pierce to eventually climb into genuine comfort and authority. This matters, I think, because it means the story we have been telling tonight, hard as it is, actually represents something close to a favourable version of Victorian domestic service, at least in terms of the structure and stability it offered. Sarah has colleagues. She has a clear if slow path toward advancement. She has in Mrs. Pierce someone with genuine authority who extends what mercy she can, a maid of all work in a smaller household, working entirely alone, answerable to a single mistress with no other servants to share the burden or the loneliness, often had none of these things, and her hardship, while less documented, less visible to history because there was no household hierarchy to generate the kind of records we have been drawing on tonight, was in many respects considerably greater. Change would come eventually, though it came slowly, and it came for reasons that had less to do with moral awakening among the employing classes, and more to do with shifting economics that none of the women in our story tonight could have foreseen. By the 1890s and into the early years of the 20th century, a handful of reform-minded voices began writing seriously about servant welfare, publishing surveys and pamphlets that documented, in the kind of systematic detail we touched on earlier, exactly the pattern of graduated hunger and exhaustion that Sarah's household embodied so completely. These voices were not, for the most part, radical reformers in any dramatic sense. Many were themselves comfortably middle or upper-class women, writing from a position of genuine if limited concern, arguing not that the servant system itself was wrong, but that it could be managed more humanly, more efficiently, with better outcomes for everyone involved, employer and employed alike. The larger force reshaping domestic service, though, was simply economic. As factory work and later clerical and retail positions expanded and offered wages and working hours that increasingly compared favourably to the long, poorly compensated hours of service, fewer young women chose domestic work when other options existed. Households found it steadily harder to attract and retain good staff, and this scarcity, more than any appeal to conscience, forced gradual improvements in wages, hours, and yes, eventually food. By the 1920s, the whole elaborate architecture of servant hierarchy we have spent tonight exploring was already crumbling, hastened along dramatically by the aftermath of the First World War, which pulled countless young women into factory and clerical work that never fully released them back into service afterward, and by a shifting cultural sense, however slow and uneven, that the old rigid distinctions between served and serving no longer fit the world that was emerging. None of this, of course, was any comfort to Sarah in 1883, standing at the edge of a system that would take decades longer to meaningfully soften. She could not see the reforms coming. She could not know that the daughters of girls like her, a generation or two down the line, would have genuinely different choices available to them. Factory positions and clerical work, and eventually, much further off, opportunities that her own grandmother could not have imagined. She lived inside the system as it existed, in the moment it existed, with no particular reason to believe it would ever meaningfully change, and I think that is worth sitting with honestly tonight, rather than rushing too quickly toward the comfort of knowing, from our vantage point more than a century later, that things did eventually improve. For Sarah tonight, right now at 9:30 with her bread and dripping in front of her, there is no eventually. There is only tonight and tomorrow morning at 5, and the long unbroken chain of identical days stretching out ahead of her with no clear end in sight. Let me tell you about Sarah's half day, because not every hour of her week looked like the ones we have spent tonight, and I think this quieter thread deserves its own space. Once every other Sunday, if the household's needs allowed for it, which during the season they often did not, Sarah was granted a half-day free from after the midday meal until she was required back for evening duties around 6. It was not much. 4 hours, perhaps 5 if she was fortunate, and nothing upstairs demanded an early return. But I want you to understand what those 4 hours meant to a girl living the rest of her week the way we have described tonight, because the meaning of them was entirely out of proportion to their length. She would walk usually down the long lane away from the house, past the kitchen gardens and the stables, and out into the open fields beyond the estate's formal grounds, where the hedgerows grew wild and untrimmed, and nobody required anything of her at all. There was a particular spot, a stile at the corner of 2 fields, where she liked to sit for a while, and I think it is worth pausing on exactly what she did there, because it was not much. She did not have money for entertainment, did not have anywhere particular to go. She simply sat in the quiet, with the wind moving through the hedgerow, and a lark somewhere overhead singing the specific tumbling song that English larks sing on a warm afternoon. And for a few hours, her body belonged entirely to herself. Sometimes she brought something to eat with her, a small treat saved carefully from her tin, a heel of proper bread with real butter perhaps, or a twist of sugar dissolved slowly on her tongue, rationed out over the whole afternoon to make the pleasure last as long as possible. There is something in this image that I find genuinely moving, the deliberate slowness of it. A girl who spends 16 hours a day rushing between tasks, choosing in her few free hours to make a small pleasure last as long as humanly possible, savouring each small bite the way someone with genuine abundance might savour an elaborate meal. Because for Sarah, in this specific moment, this small hoarded treat was her elaborate meal, and she understood with a clarity that I think most of us with easier lives rarely develop, exactly how precious a small thing could be when small things were, for the moment, all she had. She thought about her family sometimes. On these afternoons, a mother and 2 younger sisters living perhaps 20 miles distant, in a village Sarah had not visited in over a year because the journey cost money and time she did not reliably have. And I think there is a particular ache in that distance worth naming here. The way service pulled young women away from the families who had raised them, scattered them across the countryside into households that were not their own, surrounded by people who were at best colleagues rather than kin. Alice had been doing this for nearly 30 years. Hannah had been away from her own family for over a decade. This particular loneliness, the specific loneliness of building your whole adult life inside someone else's house, serving someone else's family, sleeping under someone else's roof, ran underneath everything else in this world, quieter than the hunger, less immediately visible than the exhaustion, but present nonetheless. In every one of these stolen Sunday afternoons spent alone at a stile in a field that was not, in any sense, hers. I want to return to the kitchen once more, because there is a specific process I have not yet described in full, and I think its detail rewards slowing down for. The ices served at tonight's dinner, the ones that will arrive at the family's table cold and perfectly set despite July heat, required a genuinely elaborate process to produce, one that touches almost every level of the household hierarchy we have discussed tonight, and I think walking through it carefully shows you something about the sheer accumulated labour hidden inside even a single spoonful of dessert. It begins months earlier, with ice itself, cut from the estate's own lake during the depths of winter, when the surface freezes thick enough to bear weight, a task performed by outdoor male staff working in brutal cold, sawing great blocks free and hauling them, by cart and by hand, to the ice house, a small brick or stone structure built partly underground specifically to hold winter's cold through the whole of summer. The blocks are packed carefully in straw, layer upon layer, insulated so thoroughly that a well-built ice house could preserve its contents for the better part of a year, an extraordinary feat of practical engineering that most modern visitors to surviving country estates walk past without a second thought, never imagining the careful winter labour that filled it. In July, a portion of that ice is carried up to the kitchen, chipped and packed around a metal container holding cream, sugar, and whatever flavouring the mistress has requested, vanilla perhaps, or crushed fresh fruit from the kitchen garden, and then the whole apparatus must be turned, by hand, continuously for the better part of an hour, a task that falls inevitably to the lower kitchen staff, Sarah among them, her arm aching by the final stretch of turning as the mixture slowly thickens and freezes into something smooth enough to be considered acceptable for the family's table. It is exhausting, repetitive, physically demanding labour, and its entire purpose is to produce a dessert that 8 or 10 people will eat in a matter of minutes, a small cold sweetness that none of them will likely think twice about, an ordinary pleasure of a well-run summer dinner party, utterly disconnected in their experience of it from the hour of aching, hand-cramping labor that made it possible. This is, I think, the pattern that runs underneath nearly everything in this story, and it is worth naming directly here, near the ice cream, because the image is so vivid. Every single luxury enjoyed above stairs in a house like this one carries, invisibly, an enormous quantity of labor performed by people who will never taste the result of their own work. The ice cream is cold and sweet and effortless at the family's table. It arrived there through hours of winter labor cutting ice from a frozen lake, and an hour of summer labor turning a heavy container by aching hand, performed by people whose own dinner, eaten later that same night, will contain nothing resembling sweetness at all, beyond whatever small stolen spoonful might be waiting, hidden in a tin at the back of an attic wardrobe. Let us talk plainly about money for a moment, because the wage structure underlying all of this tells its own quiet story, and I think the specific numbers matter more than a general sense of inequality could convey on its own. Sarah, as a scullery maid, earns somewhere between £12 and £16 a year, paid in many households of this era quarterly rather than weekly or monthly, a lump sum arriving 4 times annually that she must stretch across the entire following quarter for anything not provided directly by the household. Hannah, as senior kitchen maid, earns somewhat more, perhaps £18 to £22 annually. Mrs. Pierce as cook commands a wage that might reach £35 to £50 a year, occasionally more in a particularly grand household, a figure that placed her within the working class world she came from, in a position of genuine hard-won comfort. To put these numbers in some kind of useful context, a skilled male tradesman of this era, a carpenter or a printer working in a city, might earn somewhere in the range of £70 to £90 annually, considerably more than even Mrs. Pierce's relatively generous cook's wage, and dramatically more than Sarah's modest scullery maid's pay. The gender gap here runs alongside the rank gap we have spent so much of tonight discussing, another layer of the same underlying pattern: women's labor throughout this entire economy, valued consistently and substantially less than comparable men's labor, regardless of the actual skill or physical demand involved. And Sarah's wage, modest as it was, still had to cover things the household did not provide. Her Sunday dress, small personal items, soap, hairpins, the occasional letter home requiring postage she had to pay for herself. Whatever she managed to save, and many servant girls did manage to save something, however small, went toward what was called, at the time, a bottom drawer, a modest collection of household linens and small necessities accumulated slowly over years in service, in anticipation of an eventual marriage and a household of her own, should that future ever arrive. This saving, this careful, patient accumulation toward a future that might or might not materialize, strikes me as another quiet form of the same endurance we have traced throughout tonight's story, a determination to build something, slowly, out of resources that were never generous to begin with. There is a particular kind of scene that recurs with small variations across so many servant memoirs and household records of this era that I think it deserves its own moment here, because it captures something essential about the emotional architecture of this whole world. It is the scene of the mistress entirely well-meaning, entirely unaware, encountering evidence of her servant's hardship and simply not registering it as hardship at all. Picture it. The mistress of the house, perhaps a week after the dinner party we spent so long describing tonight, happens to pass through the kitchen on some minor errand, checking on preparations for an upcoming visit, and notices Sarah looking pale, moving a little more slowly than usual through her tasks. She might comment on it, kindly even, asking if the girl is quite well, perhaps suggesting she take a moment to rest if she is feeling unwell. This concern, genuine as far as it goes, never extends to the obvious next question, the one that would actually address the cause. What did the girl eat this morning? How many hours has she been on her feet? When did she last have a proper night's sleep? These questions simply do not occur to the mistress, not because she is cruel, but because the entire architecture of the household is designed specifically to keep such questions from ever needing to be asked. The kitchen runs itself as far as she is concerned, The servants are fed. In some general sense, she has delegated entirely to the housekeeper and the cook. Her own attention is required elsewhere, on the guest list, on the menu's aesthetic presentation, on 100 details of managing her own considerable social performance, and Sarah's pallor registers, if it registers at all, as a minor and temporary concern to be handled by someone else, rather than a visible symptom of a system the mistress herself sits comfortably at the top of. I find this scene more troubling in its way than any single act of deliberate unkindness could be, because it shows you exactly how a genuinely decent person, and there is no reason to imagine this particular mistress as anything other than genuinely decent by the standards of her own understanding, could preside over real suffering without ever once feeling herself complicit in it. The suffering was designed to be invisible to her, and the design worked. It worked so well that a mistress like this one could go to her grave, decades later, entirely convinced that she had run a fair and reasonably generous household, because within her own field of vision she had. She paid wages promptly. She did not shout at her servants. She occasionally inquired after their health. By the standards available to her, she was genuinely a good employer. The gap between that self-image and the actual daily reality of a girl like Sarah's life represents, I think, the single widest and most quietly devastating distance in this entire story, wider even than the distance between the servants' hall and the dining room, because it is a distance made almost entirely of things unseen rather than things unequal. I want to tell you about one more woman before we let this story settle into its final, quieter stretch, because her situation shows a version of this history that ended less gently than Sarah's or Hannah's or Alice's, and I think it belongs here, not to darken the mood unnecessarily, but because honesty requires it, and because I think you can hold this alongside everything warmer we have discussed tonight without it undoing any of it. Her name, in the composite way we have been using names tonight, was Ruth, and she had worked as a housemaid in a household not unlike this one for nearly 6 years, since she was 14, when a persistent cough that had troubled her through the previous winter failed to clear with the coming of spring, as such coughs usually did, and instead deepened month by month into something the household eventually recognized, with real alarm, as consumption, what we would now call tuberculosis. The disease moved through Victorian England with a particular cruelty toward exactly the population Ruth belonged to, the malnourished, the overworked, the chronically exhausted, whose weakened constitutions offered the illness considerably less resistance than a well-fed, well-rested body might have managed. The household's response, when Ruth's condition became undeniable, followed a pattern that shows up with grim consistency across records of the era. She was in relatively short order sent away, back to whatever family could take her in, because a household of this era had neither the medical understanding nor, frankly, the institutional obligation to care for a servant who could no longer work, and whose illness, moreover, carried genuine risk of spreading to the rest of the staff, and, worse still in the household's own calculation, to the family itself. This was not framed at the time as abandonment. It was framed as practical necessity even, in its own way, as a kindness, since Ruth would presumably be more comfortable recovering, or in the likely event that recovery did not come, dying among her own family rather than in a servant's attic far from home. I do not know, because the historical record for women like Ruth is so often silent on exactly this point, what became of her afterward, whether she recovered as some consumptive patients of this era did, particularly the young, or whether her story ended the way so many stories like hers ended, in a modest cottage somewhere in rural England, her family doing what little they could for a daughter whose 6 years of hard service had left her too weak to fight off an illness that a stronger body might have survived. What I do know, because the pattern is documented clearly enough across the broader medical and social history of this period, is that consumption disproportionately claimed exactly the population that domestic service systematically underfed and overworked, and that Ruth's story, however much or little detail survives of her particular case, represents a genuine and significant category of outcome for women who spent their working lives inside households like the one we have been sitting in tonight. Not every hard-working, uncomplaining servant girl climbed the ladder toward Mrs. Pierce's eventual comfort. Some, like Ruth, simply ran out of strength long before they had the chance. Let me bring you back to something gentler now, because I think Ruth's story needed telling, but I do not want to leave you sitting in it for the rest of tonight. Let us return to Sarah and to the particular rhythm of a year in a house like this one, because there is something almost meditative in walking through the full turn of the seasons as this household experienced them, and I think it will serve you well at this hour, easing you further towards sleep the way a slow circular story often does better than a straight line ever could. Spring arrived first in the kitchen garden, a walled enclosure behind the main house where much of the household's fresh produce was grown, tended by an outdoor gardening staff, but harvested daily by whichever kitchen maid was sent to fetch what the day's cooking required. Sarah knew this garden intimately, its particular geometry of raised beds and gravel paths, the specific smell of turned earth in March, damp and mineral and faintly sweet, giving way by May to the sharper green smell of new growth, peas climbing their supports, the first delicate lettuce leaves unfurling in neat rows. She would be sent out early, before the day's heat properly began, to gather whatever was ready, her apron gathered up to carry the harvest back to the kitchen. And I think there was something genuinely pleasant in these particular errands, a few stolen minutes in the open air, in a walled garden warmed already by early sun, before the long enclosed hours of the kitchen swallowed the rest of her day. Summer, as we have spent so much of tonight exploring, brought the season and its relentless demands, the heat of the kitchen compounding with the heat of the weather itself, until the whole lower floor of the house felt by August like the inside of an oven that never fully cooled, even overnight. Autumn brought a different kind of labour, the preserving season, when the kitchen garden's late abundance had to be turned quickly and efficiently into preserves and pickles and stored provisions that would carry the household through the leaner months ahead. Jars of fruit set in sugar syrup, vegetables packed in vinegar, a whole day's labour sometimes devoted entirely to a single crop that needed processing before it spoiled. And then winter, which we have already walked through together, the ice cutting, the banked fires, the particular quiet of a snowbound house at 4 a.m. I mention this full turning of the year because I think it matters at this point in our story to understand that Sarah's hardship was not a single dramatic event but a texture, woven into every season, present in slightly different forms depending on the time of year but never fully absent, never taking a real holiday of its own. And yet the seasons also brought their own small variations of pleasure, the particular smell of the kitchen garden in spring, the satisfaction of a well-organized preserving day in autumn, small textures of the working year that, however demanding, were not without their own quiet satisfactions for a woman who had, by necessity, learnt to find whatever small pleasures the work itself contained. There is a particular sound I have not yet described to you, and I think it deserves its own attention, because it governed the entire rhythm of this household more completely than almost anything else we have discussed tonight. In the passage just outside the servants' hall hung a long row of bells, each one connected by wire to a specific room upstairs, so that a family member or guest wishing to summon a servant needed only to pull a cord beside their bed or their chair, and the corresponding bell, labelled clearly with the room's name, would ring below, telling whichever servant heard it exactly where they were needed, and, in a rough sense, by whom. This system, elegant in its mechanical simplicity, structured every single hour of Sarah's working day in ways so complete that she had, by this point in her service, developed an almost unconscious fluency in its particular language. The specific pattern of a ring, whether urgent and repeated or single and patient, told her something about the nature of the summons before she even reached the passage to check which bell had sounded. She knew, without needing to think about it, which rooms were likely to ring at which hours: the master's dressing room in early morning, the drawing room in late afternoon when calling cards began arriving, the various guest bedrooms at whatever scattered hours their occupants happened to want something. I find something quietly unsettling in this system, the more I sit with it, because of what it reveals about the fundamental relationship it encoded. The bells did not ring for Sarah. They rang at her, summoning her attention and her body to wherever it was required, on a schedule she had no control over and could not predict, interrupting whatever task she happened to be midway through, however delicate, however time-sensitive, because a summons from above stairs took absolute precedence over anything happening below. This is, I think, as precise a physical metaphor as this whole story offers for the actual structure of Sarah's existence within the household. Her time, her attention, her very body's location at any given moment, governed entirely by wires and bells connected to rooms she rarely entered, and people who, for the most part, thought of her only in the brief moment they pulled the cord, and only in the specific, narrow sense of whatever task they needed performed. Laundry day brought its own particular texture to the week, usually falling on a Monday, and I want to walk you through it briefly because it represents another whole category of labour we have not yet touched on tonight. The household's linens, sheets and pillowcases and tablecloths, and the family's own considerable wardrobe required washing by hand, in a separate laundry room if the household was large enough to have one, using heavy coppers of boiling water, harsh soap, and hours of physical scrubbing and wringing that left hands raw and forearms aching by the day's end. This labour typically fell to a dedicated laundry maid in the largest households, though in a house of this size, some of it inevitably spilled over onto whichever housemaid or kitchen maid could be spared, adding yet another layer of physical demand onto days that already offered precious little margin for additional exhaustion. I want to talk for a moment about why stories like Sarah's so rarely survive in the historical record with any real specificity, because I think understanding that absence tells you something important about whose lives history has traditionally considered worth preserving. The family upstairs left behind letters, diaries, household account books kept in careful, practiced hands, photographs eventually as the century wore on, an entire paper trail documenting their existence in rich, recoverable detail. We know, from records like these, an enormous amount about how a woman like the mistress of this house spent her days, what she wore, what she ate, what she worried about, because she had both the education and the leisure to write it all down, and because her family in the generations after her considered those records worth preserving. Sarah left almost nothing. Most servants of her era and her class had limited formal education, enough perhaps to read simply and to write a basic letter, but rarely the fluency or the leisure time required to keep a diary, to record her own days in any detail beyond what survival required. What we know about women like her, we know mostly second-hand, through the household records kept by others, wage books and inventory lists that note her existence only as a line item, an entry of so many pounds paid quarterly, or through the occasional, precious first-hand account written later in life by a former servant who did manage, against considerable odds, to record something of what her working years had actually contained. This is why the story we have been telling tonight is necessarily a composite, built from fragments, from the wage books and the reform surveys and the handful of surviving memoirs, from the household management guides that reveal inadvertently the assumptions underlying the whole system, rather than from any single woman's complete documented life. Sarah is not a real, specific historical individual whose full story we can trace from beginning to end. She is built from the pattern that emerges when you place enough fragments side by side, enough wage entries and reform survey responses and scattered diary mentions, until a recognizable shape begins to form, true in its broad outline even where its specific details are necessarily invented. I think there is something worth honoring in this act of composite reconstruction, even as I acknowledge its limitations honestly to you. The women who lived lives like Sarah's mostly went unrecorded, individually, by the history that came after them, but the pattern of their lives, the specific rhythm of a 16-hour day on bread and dripping, the particular ache of a stolen half-day spent alone at a field's edge, the quiet loyalty extended to a girl caught with cheese in her apron pocket, these patterns survive, clearly enough, in the aggregate record left by hundreds of thousands of women who lived some version of this same story. In telling it to you tonight, however composite, however necessarily reconstructed, I think we are doing something that matters, giving shape and attention to lives that history's usual mechanisms of preservation were never built to properly hold. Let us return now to that table, because we have wandered a good distance from it tonight, through wages and illness and reform movements and the long turning of the seasons, and I think it is time to settle back into the specific, small scene where we began. Sarah is still there at the servants' hall table, and the bread and dripping in front of her is nearly finished now, the tea in her cup gone fully cold in the time it has taken us to walk through everything else. Around her, the rest of the lower staff eat in the particular, comfortable near silence of people too tired for much conversation, though occasionally someone offers a small remark, a comment about tomorrow's work, a brief exchange about whether the weather will hold for the guests' planned garden walk. Ordinary talk, the kind that fills the space between exhausted people without requiring much energy from any of them. Hannah sits across from her, finishing her own meal with the particular economy of movement that marks someone who has learnt over years not to waste effort on anything beyond what a task strictly requires. Alice, further down the table, has already finished and sits with her hands wrapped around her own cup of tea, not drinking it particularly, just holding the warmth of it for a moment before the day's final tasks call her away again. Somewhere above them, faintly, through the layers of floor and ceiling that separate this room from the family's world, the muffled sound of the drawing-room piano drifts down, someone upstairs playing something light and pleasant for the assembled guests, a sound so distant and so disconnected from the world of this table that it might as well be coming from another country entirely. Sarah finishes the last of her bread. She does not linger over it, not because she does not want to, but because lingering is not really a habit this life has taught her. Every meal something to be finished efficiently before the next task calls, and there is always a next task, even at 9:30 at night, with the pots from tonight's elaborate dinner still waiting in the scullery, still needing her attention before she can finally climb those narrow back stairs to the attic room and whatever thin rest the night has to offer her. She rises from the table. This is such a small, unremarkable action, and yet I want you to sit with it for just a moment, because it represents the closing of one more day in a chain of days that will continue tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, for years yet to come, each one built from the same essential materials: hunger and labour and small hoarded pleasures, and the quiet, constant companionship of women who understand, better than anyone else could, exactly what this particular life requires and exactly what it costs. The scullery, when Sarah returns to it, holds the particular chaos of a kitchen after a formal dinner, pots and pans stacked in uneven towers, the copper vessels used for the sauces requiring their own particular careful attention since copper scorches and dulls if scrubbed carelessly, the great roasting pan still slick with fat from the game course, everything waiting in the low light of a single oil lamp for the last stretch of the day's labour to be completed before anyone can properly rest. This is, in many ways, the least glamorous hour of Sarah's entire day, and also, in its own strange way, one of the quietest, because by this point the frantic pace of active dinner service has fully subsided, and what remains is simply steady, repetitive, physical work, the kind that allows the mind to wander even as the hands keep moving. She works methodically the way months of practice have taught her, largest items first, the roasting pans requiring the most soaking and the most vigorous scrubbing, then working down through the smaller vessels, the saucepans and the copper moulds used for shaping the evening's dessert, each one requiring its own specific technique to clean properly without damaging the surface. The water in the sink has gone from hot to lukewarm to nearly cold over the course of this final hour, and her hands, submerged in it for so long, have gone slightly numb, a small mercy in its own way, since numb hands feel the harsh soap and the scalding memory of earlier hot water rather less acutely than fully sensitive ones would. Outside, through the small high window of the scullery, the last light has fully faded from the summer sky, and somewhere beyond a kitchen garden wall, an owl calls once, then again the particular sound of a country night settling fully into itself. Sarah does not hear it, not consciously, her attention fixed entirely on the pot in front of her, on the grease that will not quite lift free no matter how hard she scrubs, on the simple grinding arithmetic of how many more vessels remain before this task, and this day, can finally be considered finished. And yet I think there is something worth noticing in the owl's call anyway, even if Sarah herself is too tired to register it, because it marks the passage of the same hour for her as for every other creature in this particular corner of England, the same darkness settling over the grand house and the tenant cottages and the open fields alike, a single shared night stretched across a landscape that otherwise divides itself so completely, so relentlessly, along the lines of rank and wealth we have spent this whole evening tracing. Let me tell you about Christmas in this household, because it offers a particular, almost paradoxical glimpse into how this whole system of rank and rationing occasionally briefly bent, without ever truly breaking. Christmas across Victorian England carried a specific cultural weight around charity and generosity toward those beneath you in the social order, an idea that had gained enormous popular currency partly through the era's own literature, and this cultural expectation did in fact produce real, if modest, changes in how households like this one treated their servants during the holiday season. On Christmas Day itself, it was fairly common practice, well documented across household records of the period, for the family to provide something closer to a proper feast for the servants' hall, sometimes even serving the meal themselves, in a carefully staged reversal of the ordinary hierarchy that everyone involved understood to be exactly that. Staged, temporary, a single day's performance of equality rather than any genuine or lasting change to the underlying system. Sarah, on this one day of the year, might find herself eating actual roast goose or beef, proper portions, alongside a plum pudding rich with dried fruit and suet, foods that would otherwise appear on her own table perhaps once or twice in an entire year, if that. There is something genuinely worth sitting with in this brief annual inversion, because it reveals, I think, that the family upstairs was not entirely oblivious to the gap we have spent tonight documenting, not in any sustained, actionable way, but in enough of a way that the culture around them demanded at least this one symbolic gesture of acknowledgement. The gesture cost the household very little in real terms, a single day's more generous provisioning against 364 days of the ordinary ration system, and it changed nothing structural about Sarah's actual working life or actual daily diet. And yet I do not think it was entirely meaningless either, not to Sarah herself, who would have genuinely enjoyed that one good meal, that one day of relative abundance, even while understanding perfectly well that it represented an exception rather than any real shift in how the household regarded her. Boxing Day, the day after Christmas, carried its own tradition, small monetary gifts distributed to the household staff, a Christmas box from which the holiday takes its name, another modest gesture that servants of this era generally valued a great deal, not because the sums involved were large, they typically were not, but because the gesture itself carried a rare explicit acknowledgement of service rendered, a small formal thank you in a system that otherwise offered almost none. Sarah would have received perhaps a few shillings from the master of the house directly, pressed into her hand with a brief word of thanks, a moment of direct personal acknowledgement so unusual within the ordinary texture of her working life that it likely stood out, in memory, considerably more than its modest monetary value would suggest it should. I keep returning in my own mind to that tin at the back of Sarah's wardrobe, and I want to give it one more moment of attention before we let this story settle fully into its quieter close, because I think it carries more weight than its small size would suggest. A biscuit tin, repurposed, hidden, holding perhaps a few ounces of hoarded sugar, a small twist of tea leaves saved back before the second brewing thinned them past recognition, occasionally a proper piece of cheese or a strip of dried meat, whatever small abundance had come her way through luck or Mrs. Pierce's quiet mercy or her own careful, patient pilfering. This tin represents, I think, something worth naming plainly. It is Sarah's one true possession of consequence, the only thing in her entire material world that exists purely for her own private pleasure, chosen by her, controlled by her. hidden specifically so that no one else, not the housekeeper, not even Hannah or Alice, has any claim on its contents beyond whatever Sarah herself chooses to offer. Everything else in her life belongs, in some meaningful sense, to the household. Her time belongs to the bells. Her labor belongs to whatever the kitchen requires of her in any given hour. Even her uniform, her cap, her apron, are the household's property, issued rather than owned, to be returned or replaced at the household's discretion rather than her own. The tin, small and modest as it is, stands as the single exception to this near-total absence of personal ownership, a tiny fortress of autonomy built from stolen sugar and quiet patience. I find myself genuinely moved by this the more I sit with it, because it tells you something true about how people build dignity for themselves even inside systems specifically engineered to deny it to them. Sarah did not have the power to change her wages or her hours, or the fundamental rationing structure that determined how much food reached her plate each day, but she had the power, small as it was, to choose what went into that tin, when to eat from it, how to savor it, and this small margin of choice, exercised patiently, secretly, night after night, represents a kind of resistance that history rarely credits properly, because it left no dramatic record, no petition, no strike, no formal complaint lodged with any authority. It left only a small tin hidden behind a folded shawl, and the quiet, private satisfaction of a girl who had found, within an almost total absence of freedom, one small space that remained genuinely, entirely her own. Let me tell you, before we close, roughly where each of these women ends up, drawing together the threads we have followed across tonight's story, because I think there is a particular comfort in knowing, even in the necessarily invented, composite way we have been imagining them, how their individual paths continued beyond this one summer evening in 1883. Sarah, if her story follows the pattern most consistent with the historical record, remains in service for another 8 or 9 years, advancing steadily from scullery maid to kitchen maid within this same household, her skill and her endurance earning her slowly the kind of modest advancement that represented genuine success within the world she inhabited. She marries eventually in her mid-20s a coachman from a neighbouring estate she meets during one of her rare free afternoons, and leaves service for a household of her own, considerably humbler than the one she worked in for so many years, but entirely, finally, hers. Hannah continues her own climb, following the exact trajectory Mrs. Pierce walked before her, eventually taking a position as cook in a household of her own some years later, carrying forward in her own kitchen both the hard-won skill and, I would like to believe, something of the quiet mercy that Mrs. Pierce extended to the girls beneath her, a small chain of kindness passed down through the same system that had once been so hard on Hannah herself. Alice remains in service for the whole of her working life, into her 60s, her body carrying, by the end, the full accumulated cost of nearly 5 decades of hard physical labour and inadequate rest, and yet she remains, by every account this kind of composite reconstruction can draw on, a woman regarded with genuine affection and respect by the households she served. Her long, uncomplaining endurance a quiet testament to a resilience that the historical record rarely bothers to properly credit. And Mrs. Pierce, already established, already comfortable, continues to run this kitchen for another decade or more, training up the next generation of Hannahs and Sarahs, extending in her own quiet way whatever small mercies she can within a system she did not build and cannot fully dismantle, but that she has learned over her own long years of service to bend just slightly in exactly the specific, careful ways that make the difference between a bearable life and an unbearable one for the girls working under her authority. I want to sit with you now in something quieter still, because I think we have covered the facts of this world thoroughly enough that we can simply rest inside it for a while, the way Sarah herself is about to rest. Her scullery work finally finished, the last pot set to dry, the oil lamp carried carefully up the back stairs to light her way to the attic room where Hannah, in the bed beside hers, is already asleep, breathing slow and even in the darkness. The house at this hour, close to 11 now, has settled into the particular hush that follows a demanding evening successfully completed. The guests upstairs have retired to their rooms, their own candles or lamps extinguished one by one as the night deepens. The family has gone to bed. Even the 2 remaining footmen, whose duties keep them up latest of anyone in the male staff, locking doors, banking the last of the downstairs fires, checking that all is secure before the house finally fully sleeps, have nearly finished their own closing rounds. Somewhere below, in the kitchen, the range still holds its careful banked warmth, ready to be coaxed back to life at 5 the next morning, the whole cycle beginning again exactly as it began this morning, and the morning before that, and will continue unbroken for as long as this particular arrangement of family and staff and season persists. Sarah sets down her lamp, undresses quickly in the cool attic air, and climbs into her narrow bed, the straw mattress settling under her weight into the familiar hollow her body has worn into it over months of exactly this same motion night after night. Her body aches in the particular, comprehensive way that 16 hours of hard physical labor produces. Feet and back and shoulders and the base of her neck, a whole catalogue of small complaints that she has, by now, largely stopped consciously registering, simply the ordinary condition of being herself at the end of an ordinary day. And yet in the last moments before sleep takes her fully, I think there is something worth imagining alongside the exhaustion, something the historical record cannot fully capture, but that seems to me entirely plausible given everything else we know about how these women built meaning and comfort inside genuinely difficult lives. A small satisfaction, perhaps, at a day's work well done, however invisible that work remained to the people it served. A quiet gladness for Hannah's steady breathing in the bed beside hers, for the particular safety of not being entirely alone in this narrow, sloped-ceiling room. Perhaps a fleeting thought of the tin at the back of the wardrobe and the small sweetness waiting there for tomorrow, or the day after, whenever the next stolen half-hour of genuine private pleasure presents itself. And then finally sleep, hard and complete, the total dreamless collapse of a body that has given everything it has to give, and asks now only for enough hours of rest to do it all again tomorrow. Let me take you through the whole house one final time now that everyone sleeps, because I think there is something worth noticing in walking the full length of it, top to bottom, in this single suspended hour when rank and hunger and labour have all, briefly, gone quiet together. In the master bedroom, the finest room in the house, the mistress sleeps under layers of fine linen and down, a fire-banked low but still glowing in the grate, because her comfort extends even into the choice of which rooms are permitted a fire through the night and which are not. Down the corridor, the guest rooms hold their own sleeping occupants, each one arranged with the same careful attention to comfort that defines every visible surface of this house's upper floors, the good linens, the carefully chosen furnishings, the whole elaborate apparatus of hospitality that exists specifically to make a guest's stay feel effortless, luxurious, entirely free of friction. Below, on the ground floor, the drawing room sits empty now, the piano closed, the great table in the dining room cleared and polished back to its gleaming, ordinary emptiness. No sign remaining of the 9 removed dinner that consumed so many hours of skilled, invisible labour to produce and consumed itself, in the end in less time than it took to plan. The kitchen, dark now except for the faint glow of the banked range, holds its own particular stillness, copper pots hung back in their places, the great scrubbed table where so much of the day's labour happened standing bare and clean, waiting for morning. And at the very top of the house, under the sloping roofline where the ceiling presses close enough that a grown woman can barely stand upright at its edges, Sarah and Hannah and Alice and all the other female staff of this household sleep in their narrow beds, in rooms without fires, under blankets considerably thinner than anything found even 1 floor below. This is the full architecture of the house made visible in a single vertical slice, wealth and comfort concentrated at the top, diminishing steadily as you climb higher, an inversion so precise it feels almost deliberate, though it was not in any conscious sense designed this way. It's simply accumulated, decision by small decision, over generations of households built exactly this way, warmth and comfort and abundance settling naturally toward those who commanded it, and cold and thin blankets and rationed food settling, with the same natural inevitability, toward those who did not. I do not think this image needs much further comment from me. I think it speaks for itself, plainly enough, if you let it sit with you for a moment the way I have been sitting with it throughout this whole story tonight. A house, sleeping, its architecture of inequality made visible simply by walking, floor by floor, from the warmest room to the coldest, from the most abundant table to the thinnest one, and finding at the very top, under the eaves, the women whose labour made every floor below them possible, resting now, finally, in the one stretch of the day that genuinely, entirely belongs to them. Morning will come again, of course, the way it always does. 5 o'clock arriving with the same quiet inevitability it arrives every day of Sarah's working life, and I think there is something worth sitting with in that continuity too. The sheer, patient repetition of it before we let this particular night close for good. The fire will need lighting again, the water will need carrying again, the whole elaborate machine of the household will begin assembling itself once more, exactly as it has every morning for as long as Sarah has worked here, exactly as it will continue for years yet to come, until the slow changes we discussed earlier, the shifting economics, the gradual softening of the old rigid hierarchies, finally reach far enough into households like this one to meaningfully alter the pattern. But that is tomorrow's story, and tomorrow's story is not the one we are telling tonight. Tonight belongs to this single evening, this single meal at the servants' hall table, this single narrow bed in the attic where Sarah now sleeps, her body finally, briefly at rest. I think there is a particular kind of dignity in this rest, even knowing what tomorrow holds, even knowing the cycle will simply repeat itself without any dramatic resolution or rescue arriving to change its fundamental shape. It is the dignity of simply enduring, day after day, with skill and quiet loyalty and small private pleasures carved out of almost nothing. A dignity that history rarely names properly, but that deserves, I think, to be recognized clearly here in the telling of this one composite, invented and yet fundamentally true story. I find myself thinking, as we come toward the close of tonight's journey together, about what actually survives from a life like Sarah's, across the more than a century that separates her world from yours. Not letters, mostly, not diaries, not photographs in any great abundance. What survives instead is pattern, the accumulated shape of thousands of lives like hers, visible now only through fragments, wage books and reform surveys, and the occasional precious memoir, pieced together the way we have pieced together her story tonight. And what survives too, I think, is something less tangible but no less real, a kind of quiet solidarity between women that reaches in its own way across all that distance of time, the same instinct that made Hannah step forward to protect a younger girl caught with cheese in her pocket, the same instinct, perhaps, that makes you, listening tonight, feel something for a girl who lived and worked and slept in this house more than 140 years before you were born. A girl who never knew your name, who could not have imagined the world you live in, and who would, I think, be quietly, genuinely glad to know that her story, however invented in its particulars, however necessarily composite, is still being told, still being sat with, still being felt, by someone lying in the dark on the other side of so much time, so much distance, so much change. I want to close the historical portion of tonight's story now with one final thought, one that has been sitting underneath everything we have discussed, and I think it deserves to be named plainly before we let the story ease fully into rest. There is a particular kind of historical narrative that likes to resolve neatly, that wants to tell you either that the past was simply uncomplicatedly cruel, a dark contrast against our own supposedly enlightened present, or else that it was not so bad really, but people were happy with their lot, that we should not judge the past by the standards of the present. I do not think either of these stories is fully honest, and I have tried tonight to avoid both of them. The truth, as best as the fragments allow us to reconstruct it, sits somewhere more complicated and, I think, more genuinely human than either simple narrative allows. Sarah's life was hard in ways that should trouble us genuinely, without qualification, hunger and exhaustion and illness that a body should never have had to carry, inflicted not through any single person's deliberate cruelty, but through a system so normalized, so thoroughly embedded in the ordinary texture of respectable society, that it required no villain to sustain it, only widespread, comfortable inattention. And within that hard life, Sarah and Hannah and Alice and Mrs. Pierce built something real too. Friendship, loyalty, small daily pleasures, a dignity that the system around them never intended to permit, but that they claimed anyway, quietly, persistently, in tins hidden behind folded shawls and warm bread left by a stove, and a girl's honour protected by a lie told with calm, deliberate authority. Both of these things are true at once. The hardship does not cancel out the dignity, and the dignity does not excuse the hardship. I think holding both together, without collapsing one into the other, is the most honest way to tell this particular history, and I hope, whatever else you take from tonight's story as you drift towards sleep, you will carry forward at least this much, a sense of these women as fully real, fully complicated, fully human, neither simple victims nor simple survivors, but something considerably richer than either category allows. Women who cooked abundance they were never permitted to taste, and who built, out of what remained to them, lives that mattered, on their own terms, regardless of whether the household above stairs ever thought to notice. Let the house settle now fully into its long night. The last candle upstairs has been pinched out. The last banked fire glows quietly in the dark kitchen, keeping its small store of warmth for the morning still hours away. The bells hang silent in their passage, waiting for hands that will not reach for them again until well past dawn. Somewhere above the roofline, the same stars that hung over the fields Sarah walked through on her last free Sunday afternoon continue their own slow, indifferent turning, entirely unconcerned with rank or rationing or any of the careful human hierarchies built beneath them. I think there is something worth borrowing from this stillness, for you right now, wherever you actually are tonight, however far removed in time and comfort and circumstance from the world we have spent these hours exploring together. Sarah's exhaustion at the end of her 16-hour day was not the same as your exhaustion tonight, and I would never want to flatten the very real differences between her circumstances and yours into some easy, comfortable equivalence. But the basic human need underneath it, the need for rest, for the body to finally stop, for the mind to release its grip on the day's demands and simply let go, that need runs the same through every era, every rank, every house grand or humble. Sarah earned her rest tonight completely through 16 hours of labour most of us can barely imagine sustaining even once, let alone day after day for years. You have earned yours too in whatever way your own day required of you, and I think it is worth letting that permission settle over you now. The same permission Sarah gave herself, without guilt, without further obligation, simply the quiet, complete surrender into sleep that a hard day rightfully deserves. I want to leave you in these final long stretches of tonight's story simply resting inside the images we have built together, returning to them slowly, one at a time, the way your own mind might drift, unhurried, across the events of your own day as sleep finally claims you. The bread and dripping, plain and thin, and yet enough, somehow, across so many years to sustain a body through labour most of us will never have to know. The tin behind the folded shawl, small and hidden and entirely, quietly, someone's own. The bells hanging silent now in their passage, their long working day of summoning finally, mercifully finished until morning. Picture the kitchen garden in early spring, the smell of turned earth, damp and mineral, giving way slowly to green growth under a sky still carrying winter's pale light. Picture the stile at the corner of two fields, and a girl sitting there alone on a rare free afternoon, a lark somewhere overhead singing its long, tumbling song, no one requiring anything of her at all for these few unhurried hours. Picture the ice house packed with winter's cold, holding its careful store against the coming heat of summer, patient, invisible, until the moment its contents are finally needed. Picture the warm bread left quietly by the stove, an unspoken kindness passed from one exhausted woman to another, needing no acknowledgement beyond its own quiet existence. Picture Hannah's steady breathing in the bed beside Sarah's, the particular safety of not being alone in the dark. Picture Alice, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, holding its warmth for just a moment before the day's last task calls her away again. Picture Mrs. Pierce, asleep now in her own slightly better appointed room, having spent one more day extending what small mercies she could within a system built without room for them. Picture the whole house, top to bottom, finally still, the elaborate architecture of rank and hierarchy suspended, for these few dark hours, in the shared democratic fact of sleep itself, the one condition that reaches every floor of the house equally, servant and family alike, without regard for rank, without regard for wages, without regard for anything at all beyond the simple universal human need to rest. Let these images move slowly through your own mind now, the way still water moves, barely perceptibly, carrying you gently along with it. There is no more information to absorb tonight, no more facts to hold on to, nothing left to do but simply drift, along with Sarah, along with this whole quiet sleeping house, into the deep unbroken rest that a long day, hers and yours both, has more than earned. I told you right at the very beginning of tonight's story that this was never really a story about the feasts remembered in old menus and old letters, the 9 removed dinners and the perfectly clarified soups and the ices turned by aching hand through a whole summer hour. It was always a story about the women who made those feasts possible and were never permitted to taste them, the ones who went to bed hungry in a house that never, in its own experience of itself, went without anything at all. I think it is worth returning to that thought now, one final time, because I believe it carries more weight now after everything we have walked through together than it could have carried at the start, when Sarah was still a stranger to you, a girl at the far end of a bench whose name you did not yet know. She is not a stranger anymore. You know the shape of her days now, the 5 o'clock mornings and the 16-hour stretches and the bread and dripping eaten quickly at 9:30. You know Hannah's steady kindness, and Alice's 30 years of uncomplaining endurance, and Mrs. Pierce's quiet, careful mercy, warm bread left by a stove for a girl too exhausted to ask for it directly. You know the tin behind the folded shawl, and the lark's song over an empty field on a stolen Sunday afternoon, and the particular, specific ache of a body that gave everything it had to give, day after day, for a household that mostly never thought to notice the giving at all. This is what history actually is, underneath the dates and the grand houses and the elaborate menus we tend to remember it by. It is this, millions of individual days like the one we have spent tonight inside, each one carrying its own small, unrecorded weight of hunger and endurance and quiet human connection, each one as real and as significant, in its own moment, as anything that made it into a history book. Sarah's story will not appear in any museum plaque, will not be commemorated with any monument, will not, in any formal sense, be remembered at all beyond whatever small attention we have given it together tonight. And yet I think that attention matters. I think the simple act of imagining her fully, hungry and skilled and loyal and tired, sitting at that plain table with her thin cup of tea, honours something that deserves honouring, even now, even from this great distance of time and comfort and circumstance that separates her world so completely from your own. There is one more piece of this world worth sitting with before we let the story rest. Something we have not touched on tonight. Most households of this era kept strict rules about what were called followers, the term used for any romantic interest a servant girl might have outside the house. And these rules reveal, in their own particular way, another layer of the same quiet control running underneath everything else in Sarah's working life. In many households, female servants were simply forbidden from having followers at all. A housekeeper who discovered a maid meeting a young man during her free hours, or worse, allowing him anywhere near the house itself, could dismiss the girl outright, regardless of how innocent the meeting actually was. Part of the reasoning was propriety. Part of it, more practically, was a fear that romantic attachments would eventually lead to marriage, and marriage meant losing a trained, experienced member of staff the household had spent real time and money bringing up to standard, which meant that a girl in Sarah's position, however she eventually met the man she would go on to marry years from now, had to conduct that entire courtship with real discretion. Snatched conversations during overlapping free hours, a letter or two, exchanged carefully, whole relationships built almost entirely within the margins of a life that offered vanishingly few margins to begin with. I find this detail worth sitting with because it extends something we have circled back to more than once tonight. Sarah's body, her time, and even her private emotional life were all, in some real sense, subject to the household's oversight, another small freedom she had to claim quietly, at the edges of a system built to offer her almost none of it in the open. And yet, as with so much else in this story, the reality on the ground often proved gentler than the rule on paper. A sympathetic housekeeper, one who remembered her own younger years in service, might simply look the other way for a trusted maid meeting a respectable young man during her legitimate time off, the same quiet, unofficial mercy we have already seen more than once tonight. Mrs. Pierce's warm bread left by the stove, Hannah's willingness to vouch calmly for a younger girl's honesty. The formal architecture of control was real. It shaped the boundaries of these women's private lives in ways that mattered enormously. But the human beings responsible for enforcing it were not always as rigid as the rule itself suggested, and the small, quiet exceptions they granted meant a great deal to the women who received them. There is a related arrangement worth mentioning too, because it offers a slightly different angle on the same underlying logic. When a family travelled, taking only a portion of their staff and leaving the rest to keep the empty house, some employers paid what was called board wages, a cash sum given to the remaining servants in place of provided meals, with the understanding that they would buy and cook their own food from whatever local shops were within reach. On its surface, this sounds almost like an improvement. Cash in hand, rather than a portion determined entirely by someone else's judgment of what her rank entitled her to. And in some respects it was exactly that. But the sums involved were calculated with the same careful, minimal economy that governed every other part of servant provisioning, enough to cover bare subsistence and very little more. A servant on board wages usually found herself making the same difficult choices the household's own rationing system would have made for her anyway. Bread over meat, quantity over quality. Only now she carried the added burden of shopping and cooking it herself, on top of whatever reduced duties still called her back to the house. I mention it because it reveals something about the logic sitting underneath this whole world. The specific mechanism of provisioning, direct rationing from the kitchen, or a cash sum calculated to land at roughly the same minimal standard, mattered less than the assumption both approaches shared. That servant subsistence should be calculated at the barest sufficient level, with anything above that understood as a luxury rather than a baseline. This assumption ran so deep, was so thoroughly folded into the era's understanding of what an employer owed a domestic servant, that it rarely needed to be spoken aloud at all. It was simply how the arithmetic worked. In every household, across every arrangement anyone had yet devised for feeding the people who kept those households running. It is worth placing this particular household against the wider landscape of Victorian English estates for a moment, because the specific numbers we have traced tonight varied a great deal depending on where a household sat within the broader hierarchy of wealth. And understanding that range gives the whole picture a fuller shape. At the very grandest end sat the truly enormous estates, 50, 60 rooms, staffs numbering 40 or 50 indoor servants, households belonging to the aristocracy proper rather than the comfortable professional and merchant classes our own household represents. In a house of that scale, the hierarchy stretched even further, with finer gradations of rank and often wider gaps in food and treatment between the very top and the very bottom of it. A scullery maid in a house that size might find herself even more thoroughly invisible than Sarah, her whole working world bounded by kitchen and scullery, the family upstairs existing for her almost as an abstraction, a set of demands relayed through several layers of authority rather than any person she would ever actually meet. At the other end sat the vast majority of English households that employed any domestic help at all. Modest homes with one or two servants total, a single maid of all work, managing an entire household's cleaning and cooking and care essentially alone, without the structure and without the companionship that a larger house's internal hierarchy at least provided. That maid of all work often ate somewhat better in relative terms than the lowest ranked servant in a grand house like ours, simply because there was no elaborate rationing chain above her siphoning off the better portions before they reached her. But she carried in exchange a burden of isolation that in some ways exceeded anything Sarah experiences surrounded by Hannah and Alice and the rest of the servants' hall. Our household tonight, 14 servants, 18 bedrooms, sits somewhere comfortably in the middle of that range, grand enough to support the full hierarchy we have spent this evening inside, modest enough that the gap between its top and its bottom, real as it is, never reaches the extremes visible on the very largest estates, which is, I think, exactly why it works as a lens for this history. It contains every element we have discussed tonight: the rationing, the rank, the small rebellions, the quiet mercies, without needing the kind of extreme scale that would make Sarah's story feel like an outlier rather than something genuinely representative of how hundreds of thousands of women across England actually lived. Sunday carried its own rhythm in a house like this one, distinct from the ordinary working week. Even during the busiest stretches of the season, most households kept at least a nominal respect for Sunday as a day of reduced labour, rooted in the religious culture of the era. Sarah's Sunday still required the essential work that could never simply be paused. Fires still needed lighting, meals still needed preparing, but it carried a slightly different texture than the 6 days surrounding it. Church attendance was expected of the staff in most households, and it was managed with the same careful attention to rank that governed everything else in this world. The family sat in their own reserved pew near the front, dressed in their finest, a weekly demonstration of standing within the local community. The servants, when they were permitted to attend at all, went to a later service or sat in a gallery set aside specifically for household staff, physically separated from the family even here, in a space that theoretically stood for spiritual equality before God. There is something worth noticing in that particular contradiction. The Christianity practiced across Victorian England genuinely held as a matter of stated doctrine that all souls stood equal before God, servant and master alike. Many households, including quite possibly this one, took that seriously in a general abstract sense. And yet the physical architecture of Sunday worship, the separate pews, the separate services, reveals how thoroughly the logic of rank had settled into even the one corner of this culture that claimed, most emphatically, to sit above it. For Sarah herself, Sunday still offered something genuinely worth having: a shorter working day, the chance, depending on the household's needs, of an afternoon largely her own, the stile at the field's edge, the lark's long tumbling song, a treat from her tin savoured slowly, a brief weekly loosening within a working life that otherwise offered so little variation that even this modest difference came to carry real, disproportionate weight in the texture of her days. There is a small book worth mentioning before we let this story rest fully, one you would probably walk right past if you saw it in a museum case today. It sits, most evenings, in the housekeeper's own small sitting room, off the main passage below stairs, bound in dark leather gone soft and slightly furred at the corners from years of handling, the household ledger. Every quarter of bacon, every stone of flour, every pound of tea and sugar that enters this house is recorded here, in the housekeeper's own careful hand, weighed and dated and accounted for against the household's budget. This is in its way the single most honest document in the entire house. The dinner menus upstairs perform elegance. The account books kept by the mistress for her own dressmaker and her own calling cards perform a kind of genteel discretion about money that never quite says the plain thing plainly. But the housekeeper's ledger says the plain thing constantly because it has to. So many pounds of butter purchased this month at such a price, allocated so this much to the family's table, this much to the upper servants, this much in the smallest figure on the page, to what the ledger simply calls the hall, meaning everyone below the rank of cook. I have sat with pages like this one, reconstructed from surviving household accounts of the period, and there is something quietly devastating in how ordinary the arithmetic looks laid out in columns. Nothing dramatic, no single entry that announces cruelty. Just numbers, quarter after quarter, that when you add them up tell you, with more honesty than any letter or diary from the family upstairs ever could, exactly how this house valued the women who kept it running. The housekeeper does not write anything editorial into these pages. She does not need to. The numbers do the talking, the way numbers always do when nobody is watching closely enough to ask what they actually mean. Sarah has seen this ledger only once briefly, sent to fetch it for the housekeeper during a moment of confusion over the fishmonger's bill. She did not read it. She would not have thought to, and there was no time regardless. But she remembers the weight of it in her hands. Heavier than she expected, a whole house's worth of decisions, bound in leather, sitting quietly in a small room most of the family upstairs has probably never once entered. I think about that ledger more than almost any other object in this story, honestly. Not because it is dramatic, because it is not, because it represents exactly the kind of quiet, procedural, entirely unremarkable machinery that made a system like this one run for so long without anyone much questioning it. Nobody had to decide consciously that Sarah should eat less than Mrs. Pierce. The decision had already been made years before either of them arrived in this house, encoded into a column of figures that simply got copied forward, quarter after quarter, ledger after ledger, until the arrangement felt less like a choice anyone had made and more like a fact of nature. Water runs downhill. The lower servants eat what remains. Neither statement within this house required much further explanation. The kettle in the kitchen deserves a moment too. Not the grand silver one that goes up on a tray for the family's afternoon tea, but the plain copper one that sits almost permanently on the edge of the range, blackened at the bottom, its handle wrapped in a strip of old cloth because the metal itself grows too hot to hold bare. This is the kettle that makes the servant's own tea, the one that gets refilled and reheated a dozen times through the course of a working day, and I find myself drawn to it because of how completely it belongs to nobody and everybody at once. Sarah fills it. Hannah moves it off the heat when it whistles. Mrs. Pierce, on a rare quiet afternoon, might pour from it herself without a second thought. It has no owner in the way the family silver service has an owner. It simply exists, patient and battered and entirely reliable, doing the one small thing that makes every other hour of this hard day bearable, producing again and again, however weak, however grey, a hot cup of something to hold on to. Let me slow all the way down now, because I think we have earned it, and because there is a particular texture to the very late hours of a house like this one that deserves its own unhurried attention before we let Sarah sleep for good. 10:30. The last footman has finished his rounds, and the sound of his footsteps, a particular unhurried tread on stone, then softer on the runner in the main hall, has faded up the back stairs to his own small room near the top of the house, though not so near the top as Sarah's, since the male staff and the female staff sleep at opposite ends of the same attic floor, another quiet, unremarked division layered onto all the others. The house exhales. That is the only way I know to describe it. A settling, a loosening, the particular quality of silence that arrives when every task that could reasonably be finished has been finished, and what remains is simply waiting for morning. In the kitchen, the last of the daylight is long gone, and the only light comes from the low orange glow of the banked range, just enough to outline the shapes of things, the great scrubbed table, pale as bone in the near dark, the row of copper pots hung along the far wall, catching what little light there is in small dull gleams. If you stood there, in that particular quiet, you would hear almost nothing. the faint tick of the range cooling by degrees, somewhere outside, very distant, a dog barking once at something and then stopping, the specific textured silence of a large house at night, which is never quite total silence. Old timber never stops moving entirely, water never stops settling somewhere in old pipes, but which feels, after a day this full, like the deepest quiet imaginable. Sarah's own room holds a different texture of quiet, warmer, closer, the ceiling pressing low enough over the bed that she has learned, without ever consciously deciding to sit up carefully rather than quickly, to avoid the small, sharp reminder of the sloped plaster just above her head. Hannah sleeps already, her breathing slow and even, one arm thrown loosely over the edge of the narrow bed. The window, small and set deep into the roofline, holds a thin rectangle of paler dark, not quite moonlight, more the general grey glow of a summer sky that never fully goes black this time of year. I want you to notice something with me here, something easy to miss if you move through this scene too quickly. Sarah's exhaustion, by this hour, has stopped being something she experiences and become something closer to a condition she simply inhabits. It is not sharp anymore. It has no edges left. It is simply the whole shape of her, ankles and shoulders and the small of her back, all carrying the same dull general weight, indistinguishable now from tiredness itself. This is what 16 hours does to a body, night after night, for years. It does not announce itself with any single dramatic ache. It becomes instead the ordinary baseline against which everything else is measured, a kind of tiredness so constant that rest, when it finally comes, does not feel like relief so much as absence, the stopping at last of a thing that has been running continuously since 5 that morning. And still, somewhere underneath all of that, something in her settles gently as she lies down. Not comfort exactly, the mattress is too thin and too lumpy for comfort in any real sense, but something adjacent to it, safety perhaps, the particular safety of a shared room, another breathing body close by in the dark, the low sound of the house finally quiet beneath her. Whatever tomorrow asks of her, and it will ask a great deal, tonight is finished. That single fact, small as it sounds, carries real weight at the end of a day like this one. There is a particular room I have not yet taken you into tonight, and I think it deserves a visit before we close, because it sits at the very centre of everything we have discussed, quite literally in most houses of this design, positioned between the kitchen and the housekeeper's own room, so that she can watch over it without ever quite leaving her chair. The still room, some households called it, or simply the store, a cool, dry space lined with shelves, where the household's dry goods lived under lock, sugar, tea, spices brought from halfway around the world at real expense, preserved fruit put up the previous autumn, the small, precious things that could not simply sit out in an open kitchen where anyone might help themselves. The housekeeper alone held the key. This detail matters more than it might first appear to, because it tells you something about where the actual centre of control in this household truly sat. Not with the butler, whatever his formal seniority, not even in the narrowest daily sense with the mistress upstairs. With this woman, and this key, and this room full of exactly the things a hungry girl like Sarah wanted most and could least easily get to. Twice a week, by the arrangement common to households of this size, the housekeeper opened the store and issued out, by careful measure, what the kitchen would need for the days ahead. Sarah has stood in the doorway of that room more than once, waiting while Mrs. Pierce and the housekeeper discussed quantities in a low, businesslike murmur, watching sugar weighed on a small brass scale, tea measured out into a smaller tin to be carried through to the kitchen. She has never once, in all her months here, been permitted inside that room alone. It is not a large rule, as household rules go, but it shapes her days more than almost anything else we have discussed tonight, because it means that every sweetness she tastes, every good cup of tea she drinks, arrives through a chain of permission she has no part in granting. I think of the housekeeper herself, in this moment, with more sympathy than I expected to feel when I first sat down with this material. She is not a villain in this story, whatever her authority over that locked room might suggest. She occupies her own particular version of the same trap that shapes every woman in this house. responsible for a budget she did not set, accountable to a mistress who would notice instantly if the household's expenses crept upward, and answerable in her own quieter way for the well-being of every girl under her charge, without ever being given the resources to actually improve it. She counts the sugar carefully, not because she takes some particular pleasure in denying it to Sarah, but because a housekeeper whose stores run short, whose accounts do not balance at quarter's end, faces her own version of the precariousness that runs underneath this entire household. Everyone, it turns out, answers to someone, even the woman with the key. And yet, here is the detail I want to leave you with before we move past this room for good. There were moments, rare enough to be remembered clearly by the women who experienced them, when that same housekeeper, on a particular evening, for reasons she never fully explained, simply gave a little more than the ledger strictly required. An extra half-ounce of tea, unweighed, unrecorded, pressed into Mrs. Pierce's hand with a look that asked no thanks and expected none. It happened rarely, it was never guaranteed, but it happened often enough that the women below stairs came to understand something true about the housekeeper that the ledger itself could never show, that even the person holding the key felt. Some nights the same quiet instinct toward mercy that ran through every other corner of this house, an instinct the system was built to discourage and never quite managed to extinguish completely. Market day fell on Wednesdays in the nearby town, and I want to walk you through it briefly because it offers one more angle on this whole world worth having before we close. Once a week a cart went out from the house, driven by one of the outdoor men, accompanied usually by Mrs. Pierce herself, since a cook of her standing trusted no one else to judge the freshness of a fish or the true age of a fowl, to bring back whatever the kitchen garden and the estate's own farm could not supply. Sarah rarely went along. It was not her place in the ordinary run of things, though on one particular Wednesday, with Hannah laid up briefly with a head cold, she was sent in her place, and I think that single afternoon stayed with her longer than almost anything else in her first year of service. The noise of it, for one thing, a market town on a Wednesday morning, voices calling prices, cartwheels on cobble, a texture of ordinary human commerce so different from the hushed, hierarchical quiet of the house that it took her the better part of an hour to stop flinching at each new sound, and the food itself displayed openly in a way it never was inside the house. Whole cheeses, baskets of eggs, a butcher's stall hung with cuts of meat she recognized from the kitchen but had never once seen in this raw, plain, unprepared state, meant, all of it, for someone's table, though whose exactly depended entirely on what that someone could afford to pay. She watched Mrs. Pierce haggle over the price of a brace of pheasant with a directness that would have been unthinkable below stairs, where every exchange between ranks carried its careful, coded deference. Here, for one morning, Mrs. Pierce was simply a buyer with money to spend, and the stallholder simply a seller wanting the best price he could get, and something in the plainness of that transaction, no bowing, no careful modulation of tone, struck Sarah as almost startling in its ordinariness. I mention this because I think it reveals something true about how thoroughly the house itself, rather than any inherent quality in the people living inside it, produced the rigid hierarchy we have spent so much of tonight exploring. Outside those walls, in the market square on a Wednesday morning, Mrs. Pierce was simply a skilled woman doing her job well. Inside the house, she was cook, capitalized, a rank, a role, a position within a structure so total that it shaped even the smallest exchange between her and the girls beneath her. The house did that, not some inherent difference between the women themselves. The house, and everything the house had been built, over generations to assume about who deserved what and in what order, and by whose permission. On the ride back, the cart loaded with the week's provisions, Sarah found herself sitting near enough to a basket of oranges, a genuine luxury bought specifically for a dessert planned for the following week's dinner party, that she could smell them the whole way home, sharp and bright and entirely unlike anything in her own ordinary diet. She did not touch them. She would not have dreamed of it, not with Mrs. Pierce sitting a few feet away and the whole cart's contents already accounted for down to the last item. But she remembers the smell of them still, she told someone once, years later, long after she had left service. The particular, specific memory of oranges on a cart in early autumn, riding home to a kitchen where she would peel and prepare them, carefully, for a table she would never sit at. I think back sometimes to Sarah's very first week in this house, before any of what we have spent tonight discussing had settled into the ordinary texture of her days, back when every part of it still felt foreign and faintly frightening. She arrived in early spring, a year before the summer evening we began with, carrying a small case containing everything she owned, delivered to the back door by a carrier's cart because the family's own entrance was of course never meant for her. The housekeeper met her there, looked her over with the particular, practiced assessment of someone who has hired a great many girls in her time, and said very little beyond the basic instructions for where she would sleep and when she would start. No one explained the rules to her all at once. That is not, from everything the historical record suggests, how it worked. She learned them the way most new servants learned them, by small correction, by watching Hannah and copying her movements, by the particular silence that fell over the kitchen whenever she made a mistake serious enough to draw Mrs. Pierce's attention. Her first real lesson in rank came within the first few days, and it involved, appropriately enough for tonight's story, food. She had helped herself, without thinking much of it, to a slightly larger portion of bread than her position technically allowed, not out of any calculated hunger, but simply because she did not yet know the invisible lines that governed everything in this kitchen. Hannah caught her eye across the table, said nothing in front of the others, but found a quiet moment afterward to explain, gently but clearly, exactly how the portions worked, and exactly why. Sarah remembers being mortified by it. The small hot shame of a mistake made in front of people whose good opinion she had not yet earned. I find something worth noting in how Hannah handled that moment actually, because it tells you something about the particular kind of teaching that happened below stairs, entirely outside any formal training a household might offer. Correction delivered privately, kindly, without humiliation in front of the group. This was not universal. Some senior servants in some households ran their kitchens with real harshness. Correction delivered loudly and publicly as a kind of object lesson for everyone watching. But where it existed, this quieter style of teaching mattered enormously to a frightened new girl finding her footing in a world with more unwritten rules than any single person could reasonably learn all at once. By the end of that first month, Sarah had learnt enough of the system to move through her days without constant correction. By the end of the first season, she had learnt enough to anticipate what would be asked of her before it was asked, the particular skill that marked the difference between a servant who was merely adequate and one who was genuinely valued. Then somewhere in that stretch of months, without any single dramatic turning point she could point to afterward, this strange, hierarchical, exhausting world had simply become her world. Not because she had chosen it exactly, though she had, in the narrow sense that any working-class girl of her era chose service over the scarce alternatives available to her, but because that is what happens, given enough time and enough repetition, to any system a person lives inside long enough. It stops feeling like a system at all. It simply becomes the shape of the days. There is one more day in the household's yearly calendar worth walking through before we let this whole story finally rest, and it sits appropriately for tonight's theme, right at the intersection of abundance and hunger that has run underneath everything we have discussed. Pig-killing day, as it was plainly called in most rural households of this era, usually fell in late autumn, once the weather had turned reliably cold enough to preserve meat properly, and it represented for the kitchen staff one of the most physically demanding single days of the entire year. The estate kept its own pigs fattened through summer on kitchen scraps and whatever the farm could spare, and their slaughter, however grim it sounds to modern ears grown distant from where meat actually comes from, was treated by the household with a kind of practical, unsentimental seriousness. Every part of the animal had a use, and wasting any of it was considered, across the whole rural economy of this era, close to a genuine sin. The outdoor men handled the slaughter itself. What followed for the rest of that long day fell almost entirely to the kitchen staff, Mrs. Pierce directing, Hannah and Sarah and the other maids doing the actual physical labor of processing an entire animal into everything a household needed it to become. Sausages ground and seasoned and packed into casings by hand, hour after hour, until Sarah's fingers ached from the repetitive motion of it. Bacon and ham, salted and set aside to cure in the cool of the larder, a process that would take weeks to finish properly. Lard rendered down from the fat in great batches over the kitchen fire, the smell of it thick and unavoidable through the whole house by the day's end. Even the blood was used, worked into a dark, dense pudding that most of the household staff genuinely liked, whatever a modern listener might think of it. Rich and warming on a cold morning, one of the few dishes on this particular day that actually made its way, in reasonable quantity, to the servant's own table rather than flowing entirely upstairs. I want to sit with that detail for a moment, because it complicates just slightly the strict picture of rationing we have painted throughout tonight's story. Pig killing day was one of the rare occasions when the lower kitchen staff actually ate well, genuinely well, not through anyone's individual mercy, but simply because the day's labour produced far more immediately usable meat than the family's own table could absorb in the moment, and some of that immediate surplus, the trimmings too small or too irregular for the smoked and cured cuts destined for the larder, came directly to the people who had spent the whole day processing it. Sarah went to bed that particular night with a fuller stomach than she carried on almost any other night of the year, her hands raw and aching from the day's work, her clothes smelling of blood and fat and wood smoke in a way that would take several proper washings to fully clear. There is something almost fitting in that image closing out this particular thread of the story, the one day when abundance and labour lined up honestly, when the sheer volume of what needed doing simply overwhelmed the careful, rationed hierarchy that governed every ordinary evening and left everyone for a few hours at least eating something closer to the same meal. It did not last. By the following week, the ordinary arithmetic had reasserted itself completely, the cured hams hanging in the larder destined almost entirely for the family's winter table, the blood pudding a distant, singular memory rather than any lasting change to how this house fed the women who kept it running. But for one long, exhausting, oddly satisfying day each autumn, the walls between upstairs and down grew, briefly, a little thinner than usual. I want to mention, briefly, the male servants of this same household, because their situation, while still clearly subordinate to the family they served, differed in some telling ways from everything we have spent tonight exploring. The footman and the valet and the butler generally ate somewhat better than their female counterparts of comparable rank, a pattern documented consistently enough across surviving household records of the period that it is hard to read as coincidence. Part of this reflected simple physical assumptions the era carried about what a working man's body required, compared to a working woman's, assumptions that had little real grounding in the actual physical demands of the respective jobs, since a housemaid hauling coal scuttles and water buckets up several flights of stairs performed labour every bit as demanding as a footman's more visible, more ceremonial duties. But the household's own internal logic, absorbing the broader gender assumptions of Victorian society at large, simply allotted more food, more consistently, to its male staff. One more layer of inequality folded into a system already thick with them. I think about what happens to girls like Sarah in the years that follow a night like the one we have spent together, and the honest answer is that their futures varied enormously, shaped by factors mostly outside their own control. Some married, a fellow servant perhaps, or a young tradesman met during a rare free afternoon, and marriage, whatever its own considerable hardships for a working-class woman of this era, at least offered an exit from service into a household of her own. Others simply continued, year after year, climbing the internal hierarchy slowly if they were skilled and fortunate, from scullery maid to kitchen maid, perhaps eventually to cook, following the exact path Mrs. Pierce herself walked decades earlier. That path was real. Women did climb it, Sarah, if she stayed capable and fortunate, had a genuine road in front of her toward exactly the kind of comfort Mrs. Pierce now enjoys. It would take her 15-20 years, and it would ask enormous skill and enormous endurance of her along the way, but it was possible, and the possibility of it, however distant, made the hardship of her current position bearable in a way a purely static situation never could have. And some women inevitably did not fare so well. Illness, injury, the simple accumulated cost of years spent underfed and underrested, a servant too unwell to work reliably faced a genuinely precarious future, since the household carried little obligation, legal or otherwise, to support a woman who could no longer perform her duties. I do not tell you this to end our story on a note of despair. That is not, I think, the right note for tonight. Sarah's story and Hannah's and Alice's and even Mrs. Pierce's own long climb from scullery to command were never simply stories of suffering endured. They were also, in their quieter way, stories of skill developed, competence earned, small victories accumulated one exhausted day at a time. These women built something with their hands and their endurance, even as the system around them denied them so completely the food and the rest their labor should reasonably have earned them. One last small thing before we let the story finally close. I have wondered more than once while putting this evening together what Sarah herself would make of it. A stranger, more than 140 years removed, sitting with the details of her hunger and her endurance and her small hidden tin of stolen sugar, turning them over with this much care. I like to think she would find it strange, possibly even a little uncomfortable, the way most of us would feel uncomfortable at the thought of a stranger examining our own hardest, most ordinary days this closely. But I like to think too that some small part of her would be glad, not for the attention exactly, for the simple fact of being remembered at all by someone on the other side of so much distance, lying in the dark the way she is about to lie in the dark, carrying the particular, universal human need for rest that connects her world to yours more completely than almost anything else in tonight's whole story. There is a specific sound the attic stairs make, right at the 7th step from the top, a particular groan of old wood settling under weight that every woman on this floor has learned to recognize without thinking. Hannah hears it in her sleep sometimes, or half hears it, the way you half hear familiar sounds without fully waking to them. Tonight it stays quiet. No one else is climbing. The house has finished, for now, asking anything more of anyone. Somewhere below, in the servants' hall, the long table sits bare and scrubbed, waiting for tomorrow's first meal to be laid across it again. The same table, the same bench, the same thin cups that will hold tomorrow's thin tea. It asks nothing of anyone tonight. It simply waits, the way tables do, patient and empty in the dark. Even the bells have gone still for the night, hanging in their long row in the dark passage, each one labelled with a room that holds, right now, a sleeping stranger who will wake tomorrow expecting fire and hot water and breakfast to simply appear the way it always appears, without a thought spared for whose hands actually make it so. The moon has moved on a little further behind its thin cloud since we first looked in on this room, though you would need to have been watching closely for a long while to notice the difference. Time passes strangely at this hour, slowly and all at once. The whole house, upstairs and down, has arrived at exactly the same simple condition at last. Asleep, or nearly so, every rank and every rule finally, briefly set aside. It will not last past dawn. It never does. But it is real for now, and it is enough. Sleep well, both of you. The candle in Sarah's own small dish has already burnt itself down to nothing, and the attic room holds only the pale, uncertain light that comes from a partial moon somewhere behind thin summer clouds, enough to outline the shape of the sloped ceiling, the washstand, the chest with its few careful possessions, but nothing more than that. Hannah's breathing has settled into the long, even rhythm of proper sleep. Somewhere far below, the house creaks once, the particular sound old timber makes as it cools through the night, and then falls silent again. I will leave you here with her in this quiet dark. There is nothing more to explain, nothing more to add, only this one room, this one narrow bed, this one exhausted, capable, quietly enduring young woman, resting at last after a day that asked far more of her than any day reasonably should. Somewhere above the house, the same stars are turning slowly toward morning. Somewhere below, the kitchen range holds its small banked warmth, patient, waiting. And somewhere on the other side of all this time you are resting too, in your own dark room, in your own quiet house, carrying whatever your own day asked of you. Let it go now. Let the story close the way a door closes, softly without a sound, and let sleep come the way it came for her, complete and well-earned and entirely your own. Somewhere, far off past the estate wall, past the sleeping village and the dark fields and the hedgerow where a girl once sat alone on a stolen Sunday afternoon, an owl calls once into the wide English night, and then falls quiet and is not answered. Good night, wherever you are tonight. Sleep well, rest now. There is nowhere else you need to be. Nothing more to do tonight, nothing more to carry, only this quiet and the dark, and sleep arriving now, gently, the way it always does when a long day is finally, truly done. Good night. The last of the candlelight has gone from every window in the house now, upstairs and down alike, and the whole quiet building settles fully into the dark, the way it does every single night, whatever the day before it asked of anyone sleeping inside it. Somewhere below, past the last quiet hallway, the servants' hall table waits in the dark for tomorrow, patient the way old scrubbed wood always is, holding nothing tonight but the memory of every meal that has ever been eaten there, hurried, thin and shared. Sleep well wherever you are, truly. Good night. The last window in the house has gone dark now, the very top one, the smallest one, tucked under the eaves where nobody from the drive below would ever think to look up. And that is where we leave her, that is where we leave all of them, asleep finally in the 1 hour of the day that truly belongs to no one but themselves. Rest now. There is nothing left to do tonight, nothing left to carry, only the quiet and the dark, and sleep arriving now, gently, the way it always does at the end of a long day, hers and yours both.